Okay, we'll get started with some comments, some welcome from our past president, Dr. James Sylvester Gaze.
Good day, Ken. I hope I can be heard. Can someone indicate to me that you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you so much, Donnell. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this very special session. I have a few remarks I'd like to make. We're here to honor the first African-American woman to receive a PhD in physics. Almost exactly, I guess it is almost exactly 50 years ago. It was 1972 that Dr. Willie Hobbs Moore earned her PhD. And it's interesting to note that was 96 years after the first African-American male earned a PhD in physics. In fact, that African-American man earned the first PhD in any discipline among the African diaspora. His name was Edward Boucher. And so Dr. Hobbs Moore was a trailblazer. I'm sure everyone knows something of her history, but let me just speak a little bit on it. She earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in Electrical Engineering in 1958. She earned a Master's of Science in Electrical Engineering in 1961, and she completed her PhD thesis in 1972. It's a thesis on the vibrational analysis of secondary chlorides. And she went on to lecture at Ann Arbor for 5 years thereafter. Leaving Ann Arbor, she had a career in tech companies, including the Ford Motor Company and the Bendix Aerospace Systems Company. But if you've done some digging into Dr. Moore's writings, I'd like to read a quote that she made in 1991, because I think it's actually very important and very timely. She was speaking to a group of African-American STEM students, and she said, "What you have to do is learn to survive. The world is not going to change. It really isn't. You've got to be prepared to survive in spite of their attitudes. You got to be excellent." And this emphasis on excellence is what caught my eye, because I have long believed that that is something that A, African-American physicists are completely capable of doing, and B, that was integral to our quest for becoming more fully participants in the discipline. It caused me to reflect on some quotes from some other people like Althea Gibson, who said, "Most of us who aspire to be tops in our field don't really consider the amount of work required to stay tops." Or Arthur Ashe, who said, "You learn about equality in history and civics, but you find out life is not really like that." So life is not really like that. And if you want to go into our discipline and thrive, you have to make an absolute commitment to excellence. You can do other things. And in fact, it's necessary to do other things, such as the recent push from so many to try to increase access for African Americans to the discipline. But those other things are no substitute for excellence. And so all of us have to be like athletes. Doing physics is the intellectual equivalent of being an athlete. And in order to reach the top, you've got to work hard and make sure that your skill set includes the word excellence. So with that, I'm going to turn over my comments to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Jim. Excellent. Thank you for the wonderful welcoming comments. What I wanted to do is, since yesterday reflected the 28th anniversary of Dr. Hobbs Moore's passing, so in light of that, and also in deference to the turmoil in the world right now, I'd like to take just a moment of silent reflection before we continue. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we're here today to talk about Dr. Hobbs Moore, but in a broader context. So I'll start it by talking about some personal reflections, because I was fortunate enough to have known her in her last year of her life. So she and I shared going to University of Michigan different times. So I was a third-year student there. I'd never heard of her. I'd heard of Dr. Edward Boucher that Dr. Gates just talked about, but I was unaware of her. As a matter of fact, I was one of the first students in my mind, black students at Michigan. I was not aware of the history that it had, and before, like the second black to get a PhD was from University of Michigan in 1918. I was completely unaware of that. I became aware of it because Dr. Ronald Mickens visited Michigan to give a talk, and at dinner that evening, he talked about some of the history. He talked about Boucher, he talked about Imes, and then he also talked about Dr. Hobbs Moore, and moreover, he said that he believed that she still lived in the community. So I was extremely excited about that, and I took it as a personal quest to try to find her. So one of the things that I did while I was at Michigan was I volunteered at a Saturday African American Academy for, some slides that you can put up. Do I need to put them up? Okay, no. The next one right below that one, yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So Mickens, as I said, talked about Imes, and then he talked about Dr. Hobbs Moore. So I volunteered at the Saturday African American Academy every Saturday morning, and I went to the director of the academy, Bill Ratcliffe, who was the father of APS fellow William Ratcliffe, and he was a community pillar. And I asked him, hey, you were at the University of Michigan in the 50s. Dr. Hobbs Moore was there in the 50s. Do you know her? And he said, of course I know her. She's right over there. And we'd been working shoulder to shoulder for the last year or so, and I never knew who she was. So I ran over to her, and she was with a student, and I said something along the lines of, hi, Dr. Hobbs Moore, my name is Donna Walton. I'm so happy to meet you. I just heard about you. It's a pleasure. And she just silently put her hand in my face, didn't look up, and she said, I'm busy right now. So we're physicists. We're used to people not being so social, so I just kind of walked away dejected, taught my class, and reconvened later when the kids were getting picked up. And she found me in the crowd, came over to me. She said, I was on the verge of teaching a young lady how to prove congruent triangles using angle-sided angle, if I remember correctly. How can I help you? And this was the beginning of a wonderful relationship. She and I and some other students would go out every Saturday, sometimes Sundays, and just interact. We would talk about her background. I mean, there was a big space, as Dr. Gates mentioned, between her master's in '61 and then her PhD. She went out and she had a family, so she worked in some local Ann Arbor companies. She did satellite calculations for Bendix Corporation. She worked at a company, Barnes Engineering, Sensor Dynamics, and then she went back to university to work on her PhD. After she finished her PhD 50 years ago in '72, she did a postdoc in a macromolecular research center, and she was there for about 4 or 5 years, and she published over a dozen papers and was considering, hopefully on the precipice of a faculty position, right? That's what we do after we have a successful postdoc. But there's another complication. Ford offered her a job as an assembly engineer, so she took that job. Yes, I think it was a pretty simple financial calculation, having a family. So she went to Ford, and she did extremely well there, worked up through the ranks there, and ultimately, one of her largest contributions was she translated the Taguchi total quality management systems from, at that time, in the 90s, right? The Japanese were eating our lunch as far as automotive manufacturing, and which is ironic because they were using the Deming earlier U.S. methods. So they were translated to Japanese. She translated them back and operationalized them for Ford to use them. So that was kind of one of her biggest contributions to technology delivery. So what happened there was, personally, I was asked to lead the National Conference of Black Physics Students, and back in 94. One of the interesting things, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about here, is that when Dr. Moore and I would talk, and we were trying to figure out these same issues that we're dealing with now, the paucity of blacks and black women in physics, and she talked about how in the 60s, Princeton University and University of Michigan were top producers, whatever that meant. Well, not huge numbers, but they were the #1 producers of PhDs in physics for blacks, all men, of course. And one of those was Dr. Homer Neal, who was the interim president of the University of Michigan when I finished, who got his PhD from Michigan in '66. So knowing her was very good to kind of contextualize the things that we were going through. So I love this picture. This picture is, I call this 5 physicists and an APS fellow. The one with the short shorts, I don't know if you know her, is another extremely close friend of mine, Beth Brown, who we lost as well. So we were planning this conference, and I was so excited about this conference because I invited Dr. Hobbs Moore to attend, and she was going to surprisingly get the inaugural Edward A. Boucher Award to reflect kind of her lifetime achievements. And so this was unbeknownst to her. I asked her, would she attend the conference? She had agreed to attend it. It was going to be in D.C., so she was going to attend. And then all of a sudden, she stopped coming to our brunches, and she stopped coming to the Saturday Academy. And after a while, I was busy doing research, so I wasn't exactly keeping up with it. But then I said, hey, I've missed our time together. So I kind of called her house. That's what you did back then before cell phones. You called houses. And couldn't get in touch with her. And, and then I found out, unfortunately, that she had passed. So it was a few months before that conference, so she was awarded that, the Boucher Award posthumously. So the recognition of the Edward Boucher Award is kind of the essence of why we're here today. The intent was twofold: to introduce her to the Black physics community, and to recognize her life and lifetime contributions to community engagement, to education, research, and technology delivery. So we'll continue that with this symposium. And we'll showcase 3 exemplars in each of these areas. So we will start with Dr. Jamie Valentine Miller, who has, in addition to her behind the scenes being the pumping heart of the National Society of Black Physicists. Yes, Jamie, we know what you've been doing behind the scenes. She's also found time to found and chair the African American Women in Physics organization, so she's going to give us a talk about her work there. Dr. Josita Jones, whom I just met in planning this symposium, I was introduced to her by another stellar Black woman physicist, Dr. Geraldine Cochran, who is on the faculty at Rutgers. And one of the things that struck me so much by Josita is that she does a lot of excellent work, which she's going to talk to you about today, teaching and introducing Black and brown kids in New York City. And just matter-of-factly, when on one of our meetings, she says that she funds this out of her pocket, which is just, it speaks volumes for this legacy that we're talking about today. And then we're going to close the session, the talks, with this gun show. Dr. Nadia, nobody knew what pictures I was going to use. Dr. Nadia Mason, who I've been fortunate enough to know for a few years. She's That's right. So Dr. Mason is simply one of the most highly credentialed, impressive, and accomplished scientists of any gender or ethnicity. And I'm so happy that she agreed to talk to us today about some of her recent work on superconductivity and inhomogeneous systems. So with that, I am going to end the opening act. And no more guys, we're gonna shut up. And then we'll close with a panel, which I'll moderate, which you'll get a chance to interact with these great people. So, how are we doing on time? We have a minute or two, so we can take a minute or two for questions, I think, and then we will introduce Dr. Valentine Miller. Any questions or comments? Sure.
Donnell, Jim Gates here. Can I make a comment?
Was that Jim? Who said they want to make a comment? Was that Jim Gates?
Yes.
Hold on one second, Jim. Thomas, could you go to the mic? Thomas Searles is asking a question.
They're messing with me. One question I had about the picture that you showed with the young people, and how did that conference come about? Kind of where is it at now, and do you think we need one for our current students?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it was a wonderful conference. It came about, some of the founders were Cynthia McIntyre and a few others, but she was kind of the pumping heart of that one. And it worked in parallel with National Society of Black Physicists. I think now, in my estimation, Thomas, with the growth that we've seen in NSBP, the National Society of Black Physicists, I think that may obviate the need for a separate student conference with the student chapters, and I like the consolidation efforts that are happening now. But this particular conference, it rotated from campus to campus, but I was a radical then, so I didn't think Michigan was ready to have it. So we actually had our conference in DC but Homer Neal spoke, and then after that, Michigan enjoyed a lot more black students attending, contrary to what you may have read in the science article. But yeah, anyway, yeah. So I think that NSBP is filling that gap now in my estimation, Tom. So that's just my opinion. Dr. Gates, you were going to say something?
We're obviously here to honor Dr. Hobbs Moore, but the Michigan tradition is in fact quite rich. As you mentioned, Elmer Iams, the second African-American to receive a PhD, also was a Michigan graduate. And he was in fact the first African-American physicist to publish in Physics Review. So this is a little known fact that we should honor at some point in the future. But definitely big props to Michigan, because they did their part to sustain our community. I just want to add that comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great comment. Yeah, Michigan's not such a bad place. Yeah. Yeah, it was funny. Iams has a very interesting history. This is not about him, but one thing is his ethnicity wasn't necessarily well known, and he was first cited and his work was recognized. He also did Raman spectroscopy and some of the underpinning work on quantum mechanics. And he was known as Iams of the US. That was kind of the way people recognized him, which is fascinating. Any other questions or comments before we go to Jamie? We have a minute or two, I think. All right. I finished way early, didn't I? All right, so I will tell you one more anecdote. Let me see if I can find it. Thought I had it. Well, okay, one quick story since I have a few more minutes. So in the abstract for this session, I mentioned that Dr. Hobbs Moore had an impact on me personally as late as last year. And the way that came about was so Ron Mickens, who I told you introduced me to the existence of her, he contacted me after a talk I'd given at Michigan on Dr. Hobbs, and he asked me a couple of questions about her life that I didn't know the answer to, because he's preparing a Physics Today article that will come out this year, again, commemorating her half-century since her conferring her PhD. I didn't know the answer to the questions, and so I reached out to Dr. Hobbs' daughter, Dorian, who is a medical doctor in Ann Arbor. I called her practice to try to get through to her, and I had to convince them that, no, I'm not a patient of Dr. Moore's, I just need to talk to her, and I left my number and didn't think anything more of it. And a couple days later, I got a text from her, and she said, hey, did you get my email? She had tried to email me, apparently she didn't have the right email address. So I said, no, and I said I wanted to talk to her. And then she sent me this text. I thought that I had it available, but I'll give you the gist of it. She said, I hope that you know that my mother considered you her and her brother's sibling. And she said that she wanted to tell you that she had cancer, but she didn't want to distract you from your work. She was so proud of you. And I was completely moved by this. I was like, woman, couldn't you have told me this 20 years ago? But imagine, rewind your calendars back to, December of 21, right? And that was Delta. Delta was here, so things were very isolated. So to get that message at that time was such a moving and an emotional and reassuring thing. So even, after her passing in '94, so much later, to know that, things like that kind of legacy can still exist is a wonderful thing. So, any questions or anything? Like I said, I wrapped up too quickly, so we got a minute or two before Jamie's supposed to officially start. Thomas, you don't have any more rabble-rousing questions about the old days? Okay, all right. Back to the mic.
When you talk to her about her experiences in electrical engineering versus her experiences in physics, at the time when she was, I think she was at Michigan the entire time, or?
Well, so she was at Michigan for her bachelor's and master's straight through. Then she went to work in Ann Arbor, Connecticut, then came back to Michigan for grad school. So that there was a gap between 61 and 60. I want to say 68. She came back for her PhD.
Yeah. So a lot of times in physics, people like to compartmentalize themselves into different disciplines, and you only go to March meeting, and you're only a experimental condensed matter physicist. But it seems like, from my understanding of her work and her life, she was across the board engineering, applied physics,
Right.
electrical engineering.
Right.
Similar to yourself, Dr. Walton. So could you say a little bit about her experiences as a black woman in engineering, physics, or did she even think that it was a difference?
Right. Oh, okay. That's great. So one thing I would say is, I think it's a little bit, so there are two things there. There's kind of specialization versus generalization. But I think even bigger demarcation is the times, right? I was reading something the other day, and I haven't fact-checked it yet, is that 90% of the scientists that have ever lived on Earth are living right now. So we can afford to be more specialized today than we did back then. At that time, she was smart, and she had a family, and she was working, right? She was doing different things, and I think she had to, right? And she did specialization, as Jim Gates said, she did the Raman spectroscopy and calculations for the secondary chlorides and PVC, and then she did the macromolecular work, and then she did more specialization as a postdoc. But then she branched out again when she went into industry. So I think that hyper specialization, we're seeing a lot more of that today than we did 1 or 2 generations ago. And so I know that you asked a question about as a black woman and as a black woman, but I think that there are, not picking on you about this, Thomas, but I think that a lot of times we have a tendency to treat ethnicities and gender separate from the political, economic, and social dynamics of the country, right? And I think that she was working as an engineer, and that's where the market was. And the same thing for physics, yeah. And then on top of that, she was a black woman, right? As a black woman, yeah. I'm gonna have to speak longer next time, so I don't have time for. Nadia, I saw your hand up. Oh, okay.
So can you say a little bit more about her life in industry and how that would have contrasted against academia at the time?
Yeah. So I think that our colleague April Hodari talked in the science article talking about the priesthood of science, which is not so different, or particularly academia, that is not so different then as now, and hopefully not will always be. And I think that there was just more, there were more opportunities. She didn't hire into industry at a PhD level role, right? She was kind of a hyper qualified engineer, but it was just above an entry level role, right? So she never really worked, to my knowledge, as a research scientist or engineer at Ford. She was always, I mean, when she retired, she was an executive in the quality organization. So there's something in your question around kind of differentiating between industry and academia, but particularly for her, I think that she just gotta, well, I'll put it this way. In talking to her daughter, she said that when she got the job after her postdoc, I'm calling it a postdoc, after her research soft money position at Michigan, they said they moved into a much bigger house. So I think that's kind of the undermining thing. Oh,
I do have a question. So my question is, did Dr. Hobbs Moore think of herself as a pioneer? And did she ever talk about herself that way? Did she realize the impact that she had had during her own lifetime?
Not to me, Nadia. I think that that's the fun part about history, right? You don't know you're making it, right? I'm not sure whether she knew before I talked to her about Ron that she was, this is the pre-Google age. So I'm not sure if she knew that she was the first black woman to get a PhD. So I think that she, even though the funny story, one of the questions Ron had for me was, how did she end up at Michigan? And it turned out that she's from Atlantic City, New Jersey. And she told someone she wanted to be an engineer because someone who graduated from Michigan she had encountered, and they said, no, you should probably think about nursing or something. And she basically said, no, I'm gonna be an engineer. So her family came up with the money to get her a train ticket. So everything she did was pioneering. But I think that pioneers think about what's next, not what was last. So it's a long-winded answer to say that I don't know if pioneers think of themselves as pioneers. Do you guys think of yourselves as pioneers? I'm talking to you.
Well, you said you guys. I was wondering who's behind me.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm not good at the gender speech. But they told me don't say you people. Yeah. Do you think of yourself as a pioneer?
Not unless I'm forced to.
Well, let me.
I mean, this is something I was actually going to say in the beginning of my own talk, but I think that it's not easy being a pioneer. For many of us, we just want to do the science, and we just want to do the thing that we came to the table to do physics, to do research, and we recognize that being a pioneer is hard, And so why make life harder by being the first? And yet somehow there has to be a first all the time, and Willie Hobbs Moore was the first, and she's the one who allowed all of us the luxury of not having to be the first after her all the time. And yet we're still the first at something, but everyone who's the first makes it a little bit easier for those who come after them. And so I think of myself in just a line of people who benefited from those who came before, and hopefully can add a little bit to make it a little bit easier for those who come afterwards. But when you see someone who really was the first along that line, you hope that they at least are recognized and valued for the work they had to do, because it's not easy.
Absolutely. So I think that I agree, and that's why that's a wonderful segue to, hopefully my time is up, to why we're here today. Welcome. Is to to recognize that. But thank you, Nadia. But it's interesting because you are such a pioneer, and the work that we do as scientists are pioneering, or at least they should be. So we're not that new to it, right? But it's hard enough to do the stuff you intend to be a pioneer at, as opposed to these unintentional things. Yeah. Dr. Ngom.
So I believe you were the second black person to get a PhD in physics in Michigan.
No.
If I'm mistaken.
No. There were Elmer Imes was first, and then there were multiple ones a couple in the 40s. I want to say 6 or 7 in the 60s. I was the first one since Dr. Moore.
Okay.
Right? But there were like 10 or, this is something I was lucky that I didn't know. Thank goodness for ignorance. I found out after I passed my quals that there had been like 15 or so blacks in the 70s and 80s that had come to Michigan and left with either a master's or empty-handed. So had I known that, I may not have gone.
And by the way, about that qual, he's the one that solved the longest equation in Michigan physics, and that record is still there, as far as I know.
You left out the word incorrectly. I solved it incorrectly.
And have you guys discussed your experiences there? Because I know you were there by yourself for a while there. How did that go? What did you exchange? What did you learn?
You know, physics is kind of a solitary thing. You're by yourself in the lab anyway, right? You know, and we worked in optics, so it didn't matter what color people were. It was a dark room. So I don't think we ever really talked about it that way. We were focused on what had to be done, what had to be written, what experiments had to be done. So, yeah, I don't think we ever sat back and said, you know, I was the first one. You know, I was like, I just want to get out of here. That was my thing. How are we doing? All right, good. So. Thank you for your time and attention. And again, the opening act is over, and now I'm going to introduce Dr. Jamie Valentine Miller to come up.
That mute button. Hi, everybody. How are you doing today? Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope that is visible. First, let me say thank you for inviting me to share in this forum to celebrate Dr. Willie Hobbs Moore. I am Jamie Valentine Miller. I'm a patent examiner at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and I'm the founder and CEO of African American Women in Physics Incorporated. I'll start with just a brief outline of what we're going to discuss today. And then I'll break for questions at the end. So we're going to start with talking about the founding of AAWIP Incorporated. We'll do a little bit of data analysis because I know physicists love numbers. We'll talk about who the African American women in physics are, and then finish by discussing how our communities have evolved. And of course, as I mentioned, we're here today to celebrate the life and career of Dr. Willie Hobbs Moore. Donnell took my moment of silence already, so I won't do that, but she was, of course, the first African-American woman to earn a doctorate in physics, and she did so at the University of Michigan. I think I can speak on behalf of all of the African-American women in physics in saying how grateful we are for her groundbreaking accomplishment, and we recognize that we stand on the shoulders of giants. AAWIP is a nonprofit organization that celebrates and supports African American women in physics. We're also a resource for people to learn about increasing diversity in STEM. I want to talk a bit about how this organization came into being. And it's funny that you guys were just talking about being a pioneer. I agree. I think that I never knew I was being pioneering as I was doing it. And it was many, many years later when I was able to connect the dots and figure out that I was the first woman from my undergraduate to go on and complete a PhD in physics. I was the first African-American woman to earn a physics degree from Brown University, and I was the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University. And I was completely unaware of all of these things. I think, as you said, you just don't know what you're doing when you're so busy doing it. So towards the end of my time at Johns Hopkins, I've worked really hard to try to combat these feelings of loneliness that sometimes come up. There have been 2 other African American males in the department, but they were no longer there. And so in 2004, 3 things happened that really came together for me. 2004, 2005. I attended the March meeting, this meeting. I attended the National Society of Black Physicists meeting, and I attended the IUPAP Second International Conference on Women in Physics. And I have to sidebar and tell you how I ended up attending this conference on women in physics in Brazil. Myself and another African-American woman in physics, you may know, Renee Horton, had decided we wanted to apply to go to this conference, not just because it was a great topic, but also it was in Rio. Who wouldn't want to go? And so we applied to be a part of the US country team, and we were told, oh, no, the team's already full, sorry. And so we reached out to the leadership at NSBP and said, well, this doesn't feel fair. They don't have any African Americans representing the United States. And, you know, we wanted to go to this conference. And the leadership at the time said, call Brazil, ask if we can have a second team, which it blew my mind. So we called Brazil. And of course, they said, yes, of course, America, you can have a second team. And so there were 2 teams planning to go to this conference in Brazil. And of course, when the leadership found out we cannot have a Black team and a white team going to an international conference, we will unite the 2 teams, we will work together, and we will, you know, represent our country united. And that's what we did. And that year we had 5 African-American women on the team of, I want to say it was like 21 people on the team. And so that was much more than had been planned or what had happened at the previous conference. So we were able to have that impact. But by attending these conferences and meeting all of these amazing women, particularly the African-American women, when I got back, I was like, I don't want to lose that good feeling. I want to write down where they are, what's their email, their phone number, what's their website. I want to keep track of everybody, because if I'm visiting, I don't know, Ann Arbor, I want to make sure that I'm checking in and having lunch or coffee with some of these people. So I started to keep track of every African-American woman that I met at any conference. And I've ended up putting this on a Hopkins website. And that was really the beginning of African-American Women in Physics Incorporated. What do we do now? Right now, we do a number of things. We provide a virtual community, which is extremely active. We have a private Facebook group that is only for African-American women in physics, where they are able to have a space of their own. So they're able to ask vulnerable questions. They're able to get advice from women at all different levels. If you're an undergraduate and you're not doing great in your quantum class, you can get advice from graduate students, from professors, from retired scientists. Everyone is there in that group. And I think that it's a wonderful community, because most of the students are still the only one in their department. But now they know, okay, I'm not the only one taking quantum mechanics this year. I know that someone in Ohio is taking it, and I know that my friend over in Michigan is taking it, or, so they're able to commiserate or work together on some of those things. We provide some very conservative scholarships. We facilitate mentoring connections. We give a lot of support and advice. We retain a community memory, so that if a student wants to go to a school where we've seen other students not have great experiences, we're able to connect them with those other people so that they can hear exactly what happened and make a really informed choice on whether or not it's a good move for them. And then we also do senior scientist check-ins. Let's look at some data. Okay. So this data is from the AIP, and I know that the numbers are small. The graph on the left shows the total number of physics PhDs from 1972 to 2017. The blue line is the total, and the orange line at the bottom is the percentage, the number of women, not the percentage. And so you can see that the number of women compared to the total number is still woefully small compared to the population. On the other hand, as we look at the number of African Americans who are earning a PhD in physics, that number is also small. This is not a percentage, this is an actual number. And so I think it hit its peak here in the 2001 timeframe when there were 20, and now we're back here at around 10, and this data is from 2019. In fact, the numbers are so small that the AIP and the NSF have stopped publishing data on African American women earning PhDs in physics because the numbers are small enough that it makes it identifiable, which also makes it very hard for our group to verify our data with independent sources. So that's one of the challenges that we face. The other thing that I want to point out is that the percent of PhDs earned, sorry if you hear my dog, earned by women in the science field. From this chart, we can see that physics has far fewer women than other STEM fields. The biological sciences is this line here at the top. Physics is the green line way at the bottom. So we have some work to do for all women so that we can improve the climate and improve the number of women who choose to stay in physics. I was able to draw from the data that we have collected, which is not NSF data or AIP data, and pull out the number of African-American women who earn PhDs over time. And so the first one starts in I went in 5-year chunks. And so we see right here, and it is true, these numbers do make it identifiable. In this 5-year span, that's just one person. So I know who that person is. I understand why they may not want to make data available with such small numbers. And as you can see, as we've gone through the 2000s, the numbers have gone up and then they've come down again. But this number honestly is not as low as it appears because this ends with today, which means that we're not even halfway through the 5-year period. So if it stays on track, then I expect that this number should be above 20 by the time 2024 comes along. So we do see that there is a general increase in the number of African-American women who are able to get PhDs in physics. And so people ask all the time, what's the number? What number am I? Am I number 20? Am I number 72? And I cannot say as a physicist with any specificity precisely which number any one woman is, because we have to consider, do you count the date that you defended, or do we count you on the date that you graduate? Some universities have winter graduation. Would you have been counted before this person or after that person? But we can get very close within a range. And so I can confidently say that in 2021, we finally passed 100 African-American women with PhDs in physics. The number in astronomy is much smaller, sadly. And so there is still some work to be done there. That number is under 25. But wait, there's more. So when I talk about 100 African-American women with PhDs in physics in the United States, that leaves out a lot of prominent physicists. So some people earn their degrees in other countries. Some people do their PhD in material science or electrical engineering and then spend their career in physics. And so I have a few examples here. On the top left, I have Dr. Renee Horton, who did her PhD in material science at the University of Alabama. She's the past president, former president of the National Society of Black Physicists. Top right is Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, who is a theoretical cosmologist, and she did her PhD in Canada. And so she is also not counted in that number of 100. On the bottom left, we have Dr. Tabitha Dobbins, a dean at Rowan University, part of the Team Up team. She is a physicist, but her PhD was in material science. And then on the bottom left, we have Dr. Fabienne Bastien, who did her PhD at Vanderbilt. She studied astronomy. She ended up having a career in astronomy, but her PhD was granted from the physics department. So do we count her as a physicist? Do we count her as an astronomer? What about people who are in astrophysics departments or physical chemistry? I mean, there's a number of variables out there. So what we do when we're talking about physicists is we're talking about people who receive their PhD from a physics department or a physics and astronomy department or an applied physics department. or space physics, but I don't know if we have space physics. I have to go and check the notes on that. But it's a rabbit hole. It can get very complicated. So that is to say that there are more than 100 Black women who do physics, but as far as PhDs in physics in the United States, that number is around 100. So how do we find the African-American women in physics? I mean, there's no, the Google is great, but it's still very, very difficult to find them. So what I started out doing was every Black woman that I saw at a conference, I'd walk up to them. Hi, how are you? I'm Jamie. Where are you from? Who are you? And I still do that. That's why I'm a little upset I'm not at this meeting in Chicago. We also have cold called HBCU programs that have physics, that grant physics PhDs. We do a lot of word of mouth. Somebody will send a message through the website or through social media, or somebody will say, oh, I know a girl who's the first year in my department. We scour the internet and we use a lot of social media. So those are most of the ways where we find African-American women in physics. We do also get information from departments when they have a student who's graduating, but not every department does that. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, the first physics postgraduate, which was it was Carolyn Beatrice Parker. She received her bachelor's from Fisk in 1937. She did a master's in mathematics at the University of Michigan in 1941. And then in 1951, she received a master's from MIT. Because of the work that she did on the Dayton project, she ended up falling ill and passing away from, I think it was polonium poisoning. And so even though her classwork and coursework was complete towards the PhD at MIT, she did not complete the degree before she passed away. Okay, so now I'm going to start making a switch into talking about what are the things that are impacting the community and helping to increase the number of students who choose to stay in their PhD programs. And we cannot do that without talking about the impact of HBCUs. HBCUs have provided the undergraduate training for 75% of Black people holding a doctorate degree, 50% of Black faculty at traditionally white research universities. And even though they enroll 20% of Black undergrads, they award 40% of the bachelor's degrees that are earned by Black college students. And they provided the undergraduate training for 40% of the African-American women in physics that we know of. As technology continues to improve, we have an evolution in the community. And what we found is that people are building the communities that they want to see. And so I'm going to talk about these organizations and the impacts that they have had. Starting with the APS Hewitt, which is the Conference for Undergraduate Women in Physics. This is a regional conference that reaches students who might not have been able to attend a large meeting like the March meeting. And it introduces them to research talks by faculty, graduate school panels, career panels, so many wonderful things that help these young women to understand all of the different options that they have in their career as a physicist. They are given laboratory tours. They can have an opportunity to present their own research and poster sessions. And then a lot of casual meals, which they can sit and chat with other physicists, whether it's grad students, undergraduate students, or actual professionals. These are opportunities that they might not have had at their smaller schools or even at larger schools, at their home universities. There's the Black NX Twitter communities. And so there's Black in Physics, Black in Astro, Black in STEM, and each of these communities, even though it may have started as a hashtag, now they're holding virtual conferences each year. And so I know for Black in Physics, they had a week where each day and each evening, there was a different event and activity held online where students could present their research. There was a 3-minute thesis competition. They've had scientists come in and give research talks. They have wellness and self-care events. And I think that these organizations are amazing for, number one, helping those students and professionals to connect, but also allowing the next generation, the post-millennials, an opportunity to see all of the different things that they could be. I mean, there's more to life than just becoming an electrical engineer. So I think that I really wanted to highlight these for that reason. But specifically, I want to talk about Black in Physics Week. So Black in Physics Week was founded by these undergraduates and graduate students that you see here, including, I'm going to point out the African-American women. We have Dr. Jessica Esquivel on the top left. She's the lead organizer. Dr. Eileen Gonzalez, who's the lead organizer. Vanessa Sanders, Jessica Tucker, Linnell Williams. I don't know if y'all can see my mouse, I'm pointing. Zandria Chikoko, Cheyenne Polius, Ashley Walker, Marika Edwards, and Sierra Civils. And so overwhelmingly, these organizers were African-American women. And this community does a tremendous amount for the greater physics community. Next, we have Vanguard Stem, which is an online platform and community that centers the experiences of women of color, girls of color, and non-binary people of color living at the intersections and thriving on the STEM front. This organization was founded by Jedidah Eisler, who was the first African-American woman to receive a PhD in astrophysics from Yale University. Again, it's that sense of community that is really important for helping students to feel ownership in their identity as a physicist. They host a live web series where they have scientists at various levels come in and give talks, and it just makes it very approachable for the community. The Women of Color Project, this was founded by Linnell Williams, who is a graduate student at Harvard University. And as my understanding, what they do is they help students prepare their application to put it in its best light. So if you're an undergraduate and you're applying to graduate school, you don't know what you're doing. You get some advice from your professors and your advisor, but this is like a weekend intensive camp to help make sure that your essay is in the best condition it can be, and to make sure that you are highlighting all of your experiences. And so it's my understanding that this organization and their work has been able to dramatically increase the percentage of women who get into graduate school. And these are students who were already qualified, but they are now packaging and presenting themselves in a way that makes it easier for them to be accepted into these programs. And last but not least, there is the Team Up Task Force. This is the AIP National Task Force to elevate African-American representation in undergraduate physics and astronomy. And the 5 recommendations that came out of this study were: Factor 1 is belonging, 2 is physics identity, 3 is academic support, 4 is personal support, and 5 is leadership structure. And so this is a framework that departments can use to improve their retention and graduation rate of minority students. And I think that these factors and these recommendations are beneficial to all students, not just African-American students. And so I have the websites there if you're interested to see that. So that is everything that I have for you today. I will be delighted to take any questions you may have. And again, thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Jamie. We have plenty of time for questions. Here comes Angie.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. So because you have this data, you can see what universities are graduating more. Just like we had heard Michigan was doing great at one time. Are you seeing any trends for universities that are becoming better advocates or supporters of such PhDs?
I think that the trends that I've seen tend to track with like a specific professor. So what we'll note is that, over this 10-year period, they had a huge increase in students who graduated from this university. And it just so happened that there was also a professor or a set of professors who were extremely supportive and helped those students to do everything they needed to do to get out. So I have looked at which universities graduate large numbers of women with PhDs, but I also try to look at which undergraduate universities are preparing students who are going on and becoming very successful. And all of that data, all of that information is available on the AAWIP website. It's just a bit of a slog to pull out whichever data set you're looking for.
The only thing I would add is, sadly, to kind of reinforce that, we don't see a lot of trends from marketing speak. We see a lot of fads, right? Nothing really sustained. That's troublesome.
Hi, thank you very much. A nice presentation. It's a different subject, but a good friend of mine, Jeanette Brown, has written a couple great books on African American women in chemistry, and that may be another subject for a collaboration with her. Jeanette Brown, I believe she is in the New Jersey area. If you need to get a hold of her, I'll be happy to contact her for you. But Jeanette Brown, African American women in chemistry, she's written several good books on that subject.
Yes, I have her books on my shelf, and my plan for like the next 2 years is to try to do a similar type of book. I just have to overcome my inertia, but I'm working on, trying to assemble a team so that we could do something like that. She has some really nice books.
And you're lucky because your book won't be as long.
Hi, Jamie. Thank you so much for all the work you've done. So I have a question. It's a bit provocative based on my experiences. So when I was coming through, there was this context of we can't find qualified Black people. And then they would say that if you have one per program or two, that then we'll mate like animals and probably produce more offspring. So do you see this sort of like, sorry, too much coffee. Yeah, so I guess could you explain some of these fluctuations in terms of this sort of like, I would say quota of how many people could be held in a program in terms of like we only have 3 per given year or so forth, or 1 per year. Do you see that coming out in the data? Is that still the case?
I think that if there's a cohort, not a cohort, if there's a pipeline of students, then students tend to stay and finish. So if you have, I thought the number was 5, I'm sure I read that somewhere and didn't make that up, but if you have a solid 5 Black graduate students, you're probably going to attract more, because students who are applying are going to say, wow, they've got 5, they've got a whole lot of Black graduate students. I want to go there because I won't be alone. I won't have to be the first. I'll have people to talk to. I can find a barber and a hair shop and all these other things. So I don't know about the people not wanting them to multiply, but I think it is true. If you have 5, then you might have 10 soon. But if you have 1 or 2, you might end up with 0.
Hey, Jamie, it's Thomas. How are you? Good to see you too.
I'm well.
I was hoping you would come to my party tomorrow, but that's cool. So anyway, one of the things that Jamie didn't say, but I'd like her to say it publicly, is what an advocate she is for Black women in physics, especially graduate Black women in physics, to the point where I'm lucky enough to know Jamie. So if I do something crazy or wrong, Jamie will call me or send me an aggressive message in a Zoom text, like, you need to do such and such for your student that I also mentor. Mind you, I didn't know that Jamie was mentoring the student at the same time, but that's just how it works. So I say all of that long things to say, what are some resources that people that want to do a better job at being mentors to Black women in this space, what resources are there on your website or other websites that we can point to that aren't lucky enough to get a text message from you like I do?
Thank you, Thomas. I think that there's a lot of excellent information in the Team Up website that gives specific things that can be done to enhance mentoring. But I think the most important thing is just to talk to the student and to build a relationship with the student so that they're comfortable sharing. If you ask every week, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. It's just like when I talk to my 9-year-old, how was school? It was fine. I have to dig deeper so that I can really find out what's going on with him. And I think that building those relationships with your graduate students is the key, so that they will feel like, oh, it's okay if I tell my advisor that I'm having a hard time or I have a family issue going on, as opposed to some relationships where it's like, I cannot tell my advisor about this. He will throw me out of the lab. So building that kind of relationship is one thing, if you can't get a text message from me.
I would also add that would be a great project for the Committee on Minorities. I think Thomas Searles is on that committee.
Oh, you know what? Speaking of mentoring, the APS Committee on Minorities helps to process the national mentoring community. And if you're a part of that, they give like instruction and advice and classes and workshops all year long so that you can enhance your mentoring skills. And it's a really great program.
How you doing? Thank you so much. I'm gonna be also a little bit more controversial. It's part of the, I think, being a light-skinned male, Mexican-American, it's easier to forgive me. From my experience, it tends to be easier. And so I'll put myself out there a little bit more. Why, maybe we don't have these answers, but in my experience, I see the facts that you're mentioning, especially when it comes to mentors. It's an individual that makes the difference. And yet, especially at the undergraduate level, I'm seeing, and I know I'm feeling, chased out and people being chased out of these undergraduate programs. The ones that are the most supportive, the ones that are really getting the students, and the feedback from the students are just ignored. How do we, and how is this addressable? Like, how do we address this as a community? Because to me, it just happens too often, and too many people are just leaving the field. And then we have this, well, why don't we have more black and brown physicists and scientists around? And it's a catch-22.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that honestly, a part of the problem is not specific to underrepresented minorities. Part of it is that it's a part of the culture of physics. Physics is an elitist field. Physics feels like only the best and the brightest and the smartest should stay. And if you're not knocking out hundreds on your quantum test, why are you here? People will still say that to students. And it's not okay. If some students may not be great test takers, that doesn't mean that they can't be a great physicist. So here's my advice. Should a student find themselves in a program that is not supportive or that is chasing them out, they should switch programs and go somewhere else. And I didn't get into my full story, but there's a reason that I have a master's from Brown and not a PhD from Brown. It didn't work out for me. I had to make a choice. Am I gonna go get a job or am I gonna try it again somewhere else? And I chose to try it again somewhere else. I don't recommend that anyone stay in a place where they are unhappy, and that's life advice right there.
And so I assume that goes triply so for faculty as well then.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
And so that advice goes so to faculty as well then. Because we have the same experience, right?
Absolutely. There are definitely faculty who are less than happy in their departments. And some of them choose to leave, some of them choose to stay. I mean, in the end, it's about priorities. What's going to be really important to you? For some people, it might be really important to stay at a high level, top-notch R1 and be miserable. And for another, they may say, you know what? I can go to another university and I can continue to do my research there. And maybe, I'm not going to be rubbing elbows with Nobel laureates, but I'll be happier.
No, I'm sorry. This is, like I said, So when that does happen, now we see this other trend though at like the HBCUs and MSIs. Teaching is primary, and then people like myself have to hear about why. Well, research doesn't belong at a teaching education, an undergraduate institution. And research isn't, you should go somewhere else if you want to do research, because that's not what we do here. And so it's like a catch-22 again for faculty and students. It's always, it's absolutely true, but at the same time, it's kind of like, how do you get out of that, circle?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough conundrum. I definitely feel that research does belong at teaching colleges, and there are some, but definitely not enough. But it's a battle. And yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you. I hear from other faculty who are at HBCUs and teaching colleges who have a similar gripe. And It's tough. I have a very close friend who's at an HBCU, and when she arrived, she was at Brown with me. She was a postdoc at Brown. And when she arrived at this HBCU, they told her she did cannabinoid research on the brains of rats, but this was before marijuana was legalized anywhere. So they said, we don't want our university associated with that kind of research. You'll just have to find something else to do. And that was devastating because this is all that she did. This was her graduate work, her postdoc work, you know? And so I think that in some places, the mindsets are changing. And that may be in part because our senior scientists are getting older and our young scientists are now middle-aged and they're able to better advocate for themselves. But yeah, I wish I had a solution for that.
Time for one more if there's another questions or if someone has another 3-pack. Let's talk afterwards because I have a different take, but this is late. This is Women's Day, so shut up. Anything else for Jamie? We got a minute or two. All right.
All right, I'm up here.
All right.
Tab Hawkins, right now at St. Catherine's University. So I have been driven by research ever since I was an undergrad, and I started in a plasma physics lab at the University of Iowa. And then I met Vincent, right? And then I tried to leave physics, and then I got my phone call to come on back. And then I decided that I was going to pursue physics, and I was gonna be at a non-R1, and I was gonna be the best damn physics teacher ever. And who did they give me to teach? All white kids, right? I was at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Still, I mentored 50 students in my short time teaching. So now, as my mother said, the first 50 are for playing it safe. The second 50 years of your life are for doing what you want to do. So now I'm at St. Catherine's University, all women, 53% BIPOC students, and I'm building a physics program there. So everybody here will tell you, my students go on and they do awesome. So you write the script, and when you're at a place that is not gonna support you doing research, because that's what we are there to groom that next generation should they want to move in that space, leave. We'll do it someplace else because we need those black and brown voices in physics, we do. Because I'm tired, and I need somebody to take my spot. So, do it.
Mm-hmm. Very well said, I agree.
Thank you for that.
Hi, how you doing? I just have a comment. I want to say thank you for all your work, but also too, similar to what was just said, I left 2 different schools because I didn't have the support system. So, but now, 12 years later, I'm finally going to finish my PhD here at U of C. But I left UIC, didn't have the support system, left Case Western, didn't have the support system, and I kept moving with it. Even when they told me to go get a job, they said, you can't do this. I said, no, it's not going to happen. So, but I want to say thank you for that, for sharing that, and also for all your work you're doing, because now I've been in the bubble for the last 7 years. Now it's time for me to kind of network and be back active there. So I just want to say thank you for that and for all that you do. So that was it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would point out that there's a lot of physicists who left their first PhD program and went somewhere else because it didn't work out. Not just me. I can think of 2, but there's at least like 20. There's plenty of them out there. It happens, and it's very common. It's not how you start; it's how you finish.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jamie.
I wanted to add.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm almost done. I wanted to add one of the ways that I'm thinking about helping to change my alma mater, Florida A&M University, which is an HBCU, which is a state school. I hope to retire to FAMU so that I won't be doing research necessarily, but I will be able to still influence students and influence the department to make choices that will help it to thrive. So for those of you who are in industry, I know, wink, wink, perhaps you'll consider retiring to an HBCU.
Been there, done that. Thank you very much, Jamie. I got my skates like Tom Searles. All right, so we're going to move to Dr. Jacita Jones, and we'll have a chance to continue this discussion and stop apologizing for hardball questions. That's what this session is for. If I know anything about Dr. Hobbs, she beat me up worse than anybody on my committee, and I loved it. So that's what. Please ask and talk hard. So Jacita.
I'm here.
All right, go get him.
So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me on this very historic day to honor Dr. Hobbs Moore, who was the first Black physicist to graduate from the University of Michigan. And I'd like to say that I was able to follow in her footsteps and become the first Black female to graduate with a degree in physical oceanography from Michigan. And I really do thank her for paving the way for me. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about STEM in terms of community education and engagement. And I'm going to look at these couple of points: developing curricular materials for physics, which I use in my classes at NYU. And I'm going to talk about connecting STEM education and the community to the universe, because I actually teach an intro astronomy course. So how do we keep our students interested and receptive in learning the concepts that we teach in physics? And one way I see it is through active engagement in learning. And in this case, I like to create something that I call purposeful play. And this allows the student to take responsibility and control of their own learning, and it also boosts their confidence. Now, when I talk about purposeful play and building confidence in students to help them try to understand complex concepts, I also hope that it will foster creativity in my students and that they will learn how to build problem-solving skills. Now, one thing that Dr. Hobbs said that I agree with, because we make a lot of mistakes when we're solving problems in physics. And she said mistakes are lessons to learn from. And I say that quitting is the failure. Now, what about my pedagogy in terms of how I teach my students? I usually do a 15, 20-minute lecture depending on the topic itself. And I follow that up with collaborative classroom activities called lecture tutorials. Now, these target specific concepts in the class that will allow students to work together in small groups, and they can learn how their classmates, solve problems and how they think. And it also fosters socialization within the class itself. Now, some added support systems that I do besides labs, which you all know are very important in science, is also I give them other fun activities, such as I'll give them a backyard astronomy activity where they'll take, Sky Guide, one of those apps, and hold it up to the sky and actually learn a little bit about various constellations and stars. That's one way I try to, help them get a better feel for astronomy itself. And also, before COVID, I would take them to the museums Well, we don't do that very much anymore now, but I try to use various type of media, videos, current news, anything that I can do to help them build lifelong learning skills in astronomy so that they find science to be fun and not boring. So how do we get racial minority communities engaged in STEM fields? So one thing is exposure. And I can say that most of our children don't have that opportunity to be exposed to a field like astronomy because they may not have a telescope or know of anyone that does. But minority students need to have more role models in those fields. We know that there aren't that many, as Jamie just mentioned, a bit more in astrophysics, say, than just physics itself. Career Day in my community has been something that has given students direct contact with people in technical fields. And that's just a small part. I think that our churches have a responsibility to identify members in their congregation that have technical backgrounds. And in that way, they can assist on the weekends with math and science projects, and maybe even start a workshop. Providing personal support. We've all talked about how important it is to build relationships that really facilitate the students' needs. You know, there is the financial component, but then for me, I try to address the whole person. And one thing I find important is also the spiritual part of ourself. Journaling, meditation, creating a vision board, those are all important too, as well as mentoring and building a social structure for our students. Another thing that I've just looked at recently, a concept that looks at the needs effectively with care for our students that makes them feel more connected, is something that's called culturally responsive teaching. And here, the teacher makes sure that students feel connected to the content and are provided with the tools to be able to master the content. And it's really about the way that we teach our students and the way you give student access. So to help students to become more persistent in whatever STEM field they may be interested in, I actually took a look at something that was developed by Arthur Costa, who says that habit of mind can build culture of efficacy in schools and communities. And this can be accomplished through density or repetition of positive habits or behaviors. Now, if you look at this chart here, I'm just gonna look at a few of the items here, and I'm gonna go from top left to bottom right, and just look at here, persisting. That's very important. You've got to have stick-to-itiveness. I was taught that at a very early age, and I continue to focus on that. Once I start a project, I want to make sure I can complete it. Striving for accuracy. You know that that's something that we have to do by checking and rechecking our work over and over and over. creating, imagining, and innovating, which allows us, to come up with novel ideas. And then finally, remaining open to continuous learning. So again, that's what I do in my classroom, try to build those skills so that my students will have an interest in lifelong learning. So why does it make a difference to African American students? So each of us are in STEM fields, and we've all had some type of guidance, on this path. So what I feel is now we are responsible for providing a safe haven for them to talk about their thoughts and feelings and what they may be experiencing in the classroom. Overcoming racial and socioeconomic inequities. So my personal experience at a public school before integration, I had a great principal, Dr. Londerman. So I feel that in a public school situation, the principals can actually involve families, help teachers with ambition instructions, and also try to create a supportive environment. Now, addressing poverty and inequality, as I said, I reflect on my educational background that I received from this all-Black school in the 60s. Principal Lunderman made sure that he had the best teachers and that, they created this comfortable environment. They helped us to build, confidence in our abilities. And then I was sent to an all-white school, Southside Elementary. And this was the 4th grade. And there were only 3 of us in that particular school. And I remember initially it was a struggle for me, not because I wasn't prepared or I didn't have a strong foundation. It was just the environment. I didn't feel welcomed. And I remember because I was struggling a little bit, my 4th grade teacher said to me that if I didn't get my act together, I would find myself back in the cotton field picking cotton. And I was like, I'm in the 4th grade. That's not happening right now. So I went home and I told my grandmother what had happened. She could tell by the look on my face that I had a bad day. And once I told her what happened, she actually went up to the school. And of course, she was very diplomatic in the way she dealt with the white people in the community, because really she looked like one of them. So they had no idea that this little Black, brown girl was going to be coming to their school. So I've said all of that to say that we all know the effects of income disparity, race, gender, and family background on educational outcomes. And when I just think about, some of the stuff I went through in an all-white school, experiencing, these disparities, I just, I had to really make a choice. I had to decide, how was I going to not only survive in this situation, but also thrive? And what I came to in terms of a conclusion of how to handle this is to not to focus on my peers. I literally had to just develop a competitive spirit and keep moving forward. So now when I look at what's going on in K through 12 school districts across this country in the low income areas, I know that not only are they affected by budget cuts, but also the local taxes that are collected have an effect on the quality of the education that our students are receiving. So therefore, we have to try to create programs within our community to supplement what our students may not be receiving. So here I come to the program that myself and one other teacher, Makita Watkins, she's the co-founder of St. Albans Under the Stars with me. We decided that we would bring astronomy workshops to the Southeast Queens community area to serve a diverse population. Now, sometimes we do encounter a language barrier with some of the ethnic groups that are in Southeast Queens. So that's why we try to diversify the team so that the students that come to us will also feel confident and comfortable, in our partnership with them. It's also our hope that we will be able to expand suits, that's St. Albans Under the Stars, into all 5 boroughs of New York City. And I'm just gonna introduce the program to you here a little bit. And the goals that we've already reached, I've talked about in the previous slides: exposure to important issues that affect the community and students, recognition that these issues play an integral part in their lives, take active steps to apply these issues to educational, career, and civic engagement choices. So what we did was create this database and the workshops, and also engage community members as role models. We followed this 12-point checklist that I'm going to show you here, and also developed a template. So this is the database that we actually created, and this is Adeline, one of my former summer students at NYU who came out as a volunteer. And you can see here the long lines for registration, because we want to make sure that we can stay in touch with the students in our community. And we give them handouts with our organization name and also contact information. So what you see here is a sample registration of students that participated in the workshop that we had on Family Day in Southeast Queens. And you can see some of them are sisters and brothers, and they range in grades from pre-K all the way up to the 11th grade. One of the workshops that we roll out every year is incorporating M&M candy. All kids love M&Ms. So we figured this is a great way to introduce the elements of the universe to them. You can see on the pole behind the young ladies there, some of the elements from the periodic table, and they are color-coded. Here are some of the displays that we use in the workshop. So for instance, they can learn about the composition of the sun, or their body or Earth's atmosphere or a supernova explosion. And everything, again, for each element is color coded, and they can choose whichever display they're interested in. We explain to them, the composition of the object and the percentage of the element in each of the object. And then we make up a baggie, and they are able to actually take that home and eat it. This is another workshop, absorption of solar energy. Here you can see Gloria Treadwell, who is a veteran teacher in the public school system. She's a biology teacher. So here, absorption of solar energy using s'mores. Here you can see a young fellow. He actually made his s'mores in our solar oven, as you can see here, just out of a simple pizza box. Here is another student of mine, Luby. She introduced the students to the telescope. So they learn all the parts of the telescope. And there's a handout that we gave them, a sheet of paper, and it had blank lines on the side, which allowed them to fill in the parts that they had learned from her short little lesson. And if they got most of it right, we would actually give them a miniature telescope. And you can see the students here filling out the worksheet. Now, this is Makita Watkins, as I mentioned to you earlier, the co-founder of St. Albans Under the Stars. She has a master's degree in early education, and she designs all of the workshops for pre-K up through elementary school. This is another workshop, bringing the universe down to earth, where we actually Xerox the Mercator map onto a paper plate. And the students would take green paper mache paper and actually glue it on to the map and color around the landform with blue magic markers to, to represent water. And we would talk about a green earth, climate change, so on and so forth in the workshop. Now, this person that you see here in the lower left-hand corner, Camille Hart, she has a background in HR. So what she does is organize all the meetings for us, take notes whenever we have meetings, and make sure that everything runs smoothly. She also sort of floats around, takes pictures, and help out if we have an overflow at any particular table. This is another workshop, but I'll say first, the lower left corner here, that's Makita's daughter, Roland, taking a picture at the spaceship. The students, the participants, I should say, have an opportunity to take a picture, a photo picture there if they would like to. In the green shirt at right here is Eleanor Hunley. She's a junior high teacher, history teacher, and also a pretty well-known artist in the community. And she came up with the idea to make astrology necklaces for the students in that particular workshop. But what we do is make sure we tell them the difference between astrology, which is a pseudoscience, and astronomy in that part of the workshop. Here is like sort of a wide view of what we are doing with various workshops, but I want to point out there Bernadette Davis in the black shirt. She was one of my students in my astronomy class. Excellent, the best student in the class. And she graduated in 2011 with a degree in computer science and writing. And because she had taken my class, she was able to float around where there was an overflow and help out. Here we also have solar viewing with a PST solar telescope. And those are a couple of my student volunteers at the lower left looking through the telescope. The right picture, top right, is Maya. Maya belongs to the Amateur Astronomers Association of New York. And she and her husband and a few other of the members come out every year and bring their night telescopes. And we set those up, you'll see here in a minute, where we set those up for students to actually do some viewing. Here is a young guy that was just trying to jump up, to the telescope to view. And I brought out a step ladder for her. Excuse me, I'm in a hotel. Can you come back in a half an hour? Thank you. Sorry about that. He wanted to look through the telescope, so I brought out my step ladder, and he has on his little cape. I thought that was just so cute. Here's a poster session. We had many poster sessions, but this particular one was run by Paramjot. She's also an NYU student that was sent to me from the physics department to mentor. And she graduated in 2018 with an economic degree and minors in math, computer science, and astronomy. And her poster session was on what is string theory. And she cleverly used guitar strings to represent the most common elements found in planets, stars, and galaxies. And she would actually play the string oscillations on the guitar. The participants would choose one of those three objects that I just mentioned to you. And what she would do is make a wristband of those elements in each of those objects, and that would allow the participant to walk away with a souvenir. Here you can see more poster sessions. The one that you see there is what is your cosmic connection to the elements. And this is just an illustration of the periodic table and where all of those elements are formed, in the universe from the Big Bang or supernova explosions, small or large stars. Another poster session here you can see is my student, Christina. She's in the white shirt. And she took my astronomy class, and believe it or not, she was an English major. And after my class, she came to my office hours one afternoon and said, Dr. J, how do I become an astronomer? And I said, well, we don't have astronomy at NYU, but you can go to the physics department. You can get a degree in physics and a minor in astronomy. And believe it or not, she did it. I was so proud of her. And what I did do was hook her up with the department chair in my old department at the University of Michigan. And he hired her as a summer intern. And they said she was the best intern they ever had, because not only was she very proficient in the sciences, but she had great writing skills. And that was because she was an English major initially. More poster sessions. What is astrobiology? I won't go through each of these. And the other one dark matter particles exist in Earth's core. So we try to bring, current events that are happening in our poster sessions to our workshops. Now, engaging community members as role models has been one of the things that we have done successfully. And I want to point out here, you can see my pointer, Dr. Liberta Mays. She actually formed the Bank Street program in Manhattan for early childhood education. She was also an educator at Medgar Evers College. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago, so that's why I keep talking about her in the past tense. Also, we have here Marion Weber, who is a master quilter. She has quilts on display in various banks around the country. She also comes and volunteers to help us out. The gentleman you see here in the yellow shirt is Carl Clay. He is the founder and director of the Black Spectrum Theater. So we all get together on Family Day. That's one of the days that we bring out these workshops. And STEM becomes STEAM, because what you can see here is he sets up a stage and it's a jazzmobile. And he has famous artists coming from all over the country to perform that particular day. So while the parents are enjoying the music, they've already registered their children with us. So they are listening to music and the children are having fun at play in the various workshops. Here you can see I am starting to set up, this is me here, the night scopes. These are a couple of, this is my telescope, an 8-inch Celestron, and this is a Dobson telescope that was brought out by Jordan and Maya that particular day. And there were some others that came later on that evening to set up their telescopes as well. So as I mentioned to you, we started our program very small. As a matter of fact, Makita and I just showed up in the park one afternoon and decided we were going to start introducing astronomy to the kids in our community. And all I had was the solar telescope and some displays. And from there, it just mushroomed into something, beyond our wildest dreams. But if you're interested in setting up a community outreach program, we found this book on how to do that, and it gives you a 12-point checklist, which I'm going to share with you right now. 1, structure and organization alignment for M&E systems. M&E is metrics and evaluation. Human capacity for M&E systems. M&E partnerships. M&E plans, M&E work plans, and advocacy, communication, and culture for M&E systems. And believe it or not, we actually, follow this template very closely, and everything that they suggest that we should do to set up our program, we actually did. It wasn't easy. Routine monitoring is something that we do. We do periodic surveys. Of course, you saw a sample of our database. Supportive supervision and data auditing. We also did evaluation and research, and using information to improve our results. We also use the Kellogg Foundation's logic model. And this is what a logic model actually is: a systematic and visual way to present and share your understanding of the relationships among the resources you have to operate your program, the activities you plan to do, and the changes or results you hope to achieve. And this is actually the template. So just to conclude, I just want to say that if you're interested in setting up a community outreach program, I have all of the resources listed in my works cited. And I want to say, if there are any young people in the audience, just keep on keeping on, because you will reach your goal. You just have to be persistent. And I found this quote in the Bible, which I feel is very apropos to what I'm about and what I'm trying to tell you. Do not neglect the gift that is within you. And here are my works cited. This is my works cited page. So I mentioned building a culture of efficacy. Also, what is a culturally responsive teaching? That's the website. Here's the toolkit for making and monitoring evaluation systems work. I actually gave a portion of this presentation at the Mid-Atlantic Conference back in December. So that's available. And of course, the Kellogg Foundation's Logic Model Development Guide. And that's all I have to say for now, but I'm open for questions. That QR code that you see there will allow you to contact me. And I just want to say thank you again for inviting me to this conference. Are there any questions?
We have time for one question now, and we can definitely have more questions during the panel after Nadia's talk. Thanks again, Tracita. So we will keep on time and go into Nadia's talk. Well, she said that.
Can you see my, is there, let me see, there we go. Okay, awesome. Okay, so it is a real pleasure to be here. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the, if it weren't for specifically Willie Hobbs Moore and her, who broke barriers and who was both a scientist, a role model, and really paved the way for people like me, and also for me particularly. And we talked a little bit earlier about breaking barriers and how hard it is. I have to say, from my perspective, I never really wanted to break barriers. I didn't want to be the first. I actually chose a graduate school where I wouldn't be the first, where I wouldn't have to make it harder for myself to push through where no one had ever come before. And I had the luxury of doing that because of Willie Hobbs Moore. And so I'm extremely grateful to her specifically and to everyone who came before me and allowed me to be able to focus even more on the science that I wanted to do. So I'm especially delighted to be able to give a pure science talk because at the end of the day, Willie Hobbs Moore was a physicist. That's what she did. That's what she's known for. I don't work in her specific area of spectroscopy, but I thought that maybe I could best honor her by talking about a subject that is really near and dear to my heart, which is inhomogeneous superconductors. For me, it's a very fun topic. It's a topic that I started in graduate school and I've worked on for about 20 years. I just love thinking about correlated electrons. And I hope it's fun for you guys. There will be pictures of cookies at some point. That's all I can promise you. So this topic is on the emergence of superconductivity in inhomogeneous systems. I care a lot about superconductors because, they're superconductors, obviously. there's still a lot that's not known about them. And so one of the open questions that we've tried to ask for many years in my group and in previous groups is, what determines the transition temperatures and ground states in superconductors when they're disordered or inhomogeneous? And it turns out that many of them are disordered and inhomogeneous, and it wasn't really known what set the energy scales and TC in these systems. So that's what we're trying to answer. Okay, so just as a reminder of what superconductivity is, superconductivity was discovered more than 100 years ago by Camille Hart. Actually, it was discovered by his lab technician while Camille was at dinner. So they should share credit, or else he should never gone to dinner. But regardless, so they put the sample in the system. So actually, Camille Hart discovered how to cool things down to very low temperatures. He discovered how to liquefy helium. And so what he did is he liquefied helium that got down to 4 Kelvin. Then he proceeded to just put every material he knew into his system and see what happens when you cool it down. So, most materials, you put a metal at very cold temperatures and it just sort of, the resistance just drops as scattering lowers and it gets to some finite resistance. And that's kind of cool. But then he put mercury into the system and saw that the resistance dropped, but then when they got to some transition temperature, the resistance dropped all the way down to identically 0. And they had no idea that this would happen. It just happened. And so this is the mark of a superconductor, that the resistance at a transition temperature drops identically to 0. And usually it's really easy to distinguish between superconducting and non-superconducting systems. But as I'll show in this talk, sometimes, we've realized since then it can be a little bit more complicated than it seems from here. Okay, so superconductivity is the physics behind it, it's a lattice-mediated attractive interaction between two electrons. And so, one electron over here and one electron over here communicate with each other via phonons in the lattice, and that's how you get this long-range coherence in the system that allows the electrons to flow without scattering against disorder that happens at a much smaller scale than these lattice-mediated interactions that they have. So you don't lose any energy to the lattice, and you get this perfectly conducting behavior. And microscopically, it occurs via these paired electrons of opposite spins, Cooper pairs, and they condense into a ground state. So this is a real quantum mechanical state that's identified by an amplitude and a phase. Okay, so when I first heard about superconductivity, it seemed like this crazy miraculous thing, and I thought, it must be that very few systems are superconducting, because it's crazy. They pair up, they move through a lattice, it's all this complicated stuff, and it turns out that every metal is superconducting, basically, or almost every metal. What they differ on is what their transition temperatures are. So, most of these elemental metals, from aluminum through tin, mercury, tantalum, lead, niobium, these all have superconducting transitions. But you can notice the transitions are at pretty low temperatures. These are in Kelvin, so the elemental metals have transitions between nearly 0 all the way up to 9.5 Kelvin, which is the highest elemental TC of niobium. But you can make alloys that have higher TCs and can withstand larger critical fields. Things like niobium-3 tin are used in MRI magnets, for example, because they can sustain high fields. And then there's the high-temperature superconductors, so-called because they actually have transition temperatures above nitrogen, which is great because nitrogen is a lot cheaper than helium. And so, a lot of our goal in studying superconductivity is to increase these transition temperatures to make these materials even more useful in our everyday lives. Even so, there's just a lot of applications of superconductivity, as you might imagine, for something that has 0 resistance. So, they're used as high-density power lines, because even though you have to cool them down, they can withstand a lot of current in a very small area. They're used for MRI magnets, as many of us know. There's the always elusive levitating train that's been promised since I was in graduate school, I think, but it's still cool, and I think there's some small segment of one in Japan. But you can levitate things, which I had a demo, but I don't. They're very sensitive detectors. People put superconductors just at the edge when they transition, and then you can imagine you add one small bit of energy, like one photon, and it causes it to go from 0 resistance to finite resistance. That's how these superconducting edge detectors work. They can detect minute amounts of energy just by being at the superconducting transition edge. And so those used as filters and detectors in many applications. And then their superconducting qubits are probably the most common qubit element out there. These are the ones used by Intel and IBM and Google as qubit elements. And so there's lots of applications of superconductors. However, you would think that something that has such low resistance should have even more applications than you see here. And one of the reasons that you don't see superconductors in everyday life is because they still have relatively low transitions. Even the high temperature superconductors are still at nitrogen temperatures, and most of us don't want to lug a nitrogen dewar into our offices just to run our computers. So one of our big goals is to increase TC in high temperature superconductors. And you can see here that TC has increased over the years. There's a jump to the high temperature superconductors, and then it basically topped out around 150 Kelvin in the mid-90s. Now, there's been news recently of pressure-induced room temperature superconductivity. It's a little bit controversial, but those are really high pressures. At regular atmospheric pressures, we're still stuck around 150 Kelvin. And there's no physical reason that we can't increase TC. As far as I know, no one has any reason in physics that says it's impossible to have a room temperature superconductor. And so we have to believe then that the reason that we can't increase TC more is just because of a lack of understanding. And this lack of understanding isn't because we're all just dumb, right? or that we haven't worked hard enough. It's because these systems are really, really complicated. And you can get a sense of it just looking at this phase diagram. This is temperature versus doping for the typical high TC material, but you can see how complicated these systems are if you just change parameters a little bit. They're superconducting in one region, and then they're insulating next to it, but it's not even a normal insulator, it's a messy insulator, whatever that means. And then there's a region that's not a superconductor, but it has a gap, and people are still trying to figure out exactly what that is. Then there's a metal, but it's not a normal metal, it's a strange metal. Then there's a more normal metal. It's complicated. There's stuff all over the place. There's lots of unknowns still about what's going on with superconductors. So what is the strange metal? There's evidence that a lot of these systems phase separate, and it's unknown what the role of phase separation is, what the role of disorder, even what just determines the ground state when these things are disordered or inhomogeneous. And also, a very basic question is, what is the nature of superconductivity in lower dimensions? This is actually a more subtle question than many people might realize, and it's relevant to these systems because they are quasi-2D superconductors. So what is the nature of superconductivity in 2D, or when you have grains? And I'm actually going to start with this question because it is such a fundamental question. It's relevant to the physics that I'll talk about. So we can ask the question of what is the nature of superconductivity in lower dimensions. Oops, I just spoiled that. Okay, go back. Because it is something that requires long-range phase coherence. It's a ground state. So you have an amplitude and you have a phase, and you have to be phase coherent between the pairs in a superconductor. But if you have a one-dimensional system, any small amount of disorder will cause a fluctuation that ruins this phase coherence anywhere along the line, and it'll fully destroy superconductivity. So in theory, you cannot have a one-dimensional superconductor because any amount of fluctuations will destroy the phase coherence. And actually, the same thing is true for 2 dimensions. In theory, in 2 dimensions, if you have just a little bit of fluctuation, it'll destroy your long-range order. But it turns out that rather than having true long-range order, you can have quasi-long-range order in 2 dimensions, where the phase correlations decay, but just slow enough that you can still see superconductivity. And actually, this question, it was such an interesting one that it was related to the Nobel Prize that was awarded in 2016. So this Nobel Prize, the citation was it said topological phases of matter. And this is when topology is still big, but it was when a lot of people were still first thinking about it, and it seemed like, oh, it's a topology Nobel Prize. But if you then read the citation itself, it talks about how Kosterlitz and Thouless overturned the theory of they overturned the current theory that superconductivity couldn't exist in thin layers. So actually, this Nobel Prize was discovering that mechanism of power law decay phase correlations in 2D systems. And this was allowed because it had excitations that were vortices, and these were topological objects, which is where topology came in. But basically, they showed this phase diagram that showed how in 2D, the excitations, like these phase fluctuations, were actually vortices that could organize themselves into a glass or a lattice or bound phases that then melted or unbound as you went through the transition, as you can see here. And so here's this Kosterlitz-Thalitz transition, which occurs as a function of disorder, right? But again, this is it's a big enough and important enough question that it was given a Nobel Prize, which just shows you how enduring this question really is. Okay, so before going on more into 2D superconductors, I'm going to start just with a little superconducting grain. So I'll start by saying, how do you know when superconductivity can exist in a grain? And then I'll talk about how do you know whether it exists in a film. Okay, so what determines a ground state in a single superconducting grain? Now, this is an interesting question because if you remember from, people always say from freshman quantum mechanics, but really college quantum mechanics, we do particles in a box, right? And if you remember particles in a box, there are energy levels, right? And there's a discrete energy level. But if you have a superconductor that has to have electrons pairing up, and there's discrete energy levels, then the pairing energy has to be bigger than the level spacing in order for there to be a superconductor. And so that sets the scale of whether you can have superconductivity in a grain, whether or not the level spacing is bigger or smaller than the gap size. Okay, and so this was shown, back in the 90s. This is Mike Tinkham, who I did partly my postdoc with, and then he showed that superconductivity is suppressed at length scales of about 3 to 8 nanometers because of this particle in a box effect. And I should note that for something like niobium, that means that you get it's suppressed at scales around 4 nanometers. And I also want to note that this scale is much smaller than the coherence length of a superconductor, which is about 30 or 40 nanometers for these sort of systems. Okay, so that's a granular superconductor. Now we go back to these 2D systems and say, okay, now if I make it into 2D, what determines the ground states and TCs? So I mentioned this Kosterlitz-Thalitz transition. This is as a function of disorder, which can be tuned by, say, film thickness. And so it was shown that at finite temperatures, you get a Kosterlitz-Thalitz transition, but as you go toward 0 temperature, which I'm just going all over this phase diagram, but you know what I mean. As you go to 0 temperature, this transition turns into a transition between a pure superconductor and an insulator. And this was shown by Alan Goldman and others some years ago, that as you change disorder, and this is with film thickness, for thick films, you have a superconductor, and then as you make the film thinner, you get a metallic state, and then you get an insulator. Okay. And this is, I found this kind of cool, that as you approach 0 temperature, you get a pure transition from a superconducting state directly to an insulating state with nothing in between. So you think about how, what are the electrons physically doing? They're flowing with no resistance, and then suddenly they're not flowing at all, okay, which is actually a cool thing to happen directly. And there's been a lot of interest in these sort of superconductor-insulator transitions, looking at, these can be tuned by magnetic field, electric field, disorder. It's actually a quantum phase transition at 0 temperature. And a lot of theories predict that this metallic state right here should occur at exactly 6.4 kiloohms, which is a quantum resistance. And it was also predicted that you should have something that only happens above and below 6.4 kiloohms, and that should be a pure superconductor to insulator transition. However, because theories are made to be disproven, so it's actually been found that this sort of superconducting transition can actually happen at resistances much lower than the quantum of resistance, and that instead of superconductor insulator, you can get superconductor to metal transitions. Okay, now you may say, big deal, there's all sorts of metals, who cares about a superconductor to metal transition? But there's another theory that says that as you approach 0 temperature in low dimensions, your low dimensions again, that you should not be able to have any sort of metallic state. So basically, superconducting states can exist and insulating states can exist, but metallic and dissipative states should not. And this is basically, this is the scaling theory of localization, it's called. And Phil Anderson and others discovered this, way back in the day. So, after Willie Hobbs got her PhD, though. It's not that far back. Okay, so I'm looking at dates now. According to this, basically, if you have a 2-dimensional system that's superconducting, or any sort of 2-dimensional system, a little bit of disorder will fully trap electron wave functions as you approach 0 temperature. And so you should be able to have a superconductor, because it's not affected by this disorder, or you should have an insulator, but you shouldn't have a metallic state as you approach 0 temperature. So it's okay to have a pure superconductor insulator transition, but there shouldn't be a metallic state for any range of disorder or field values as you approach 0 temperature. But again, metallic states have been discovered for years. This is actually my own thesis work from many years ago, where you see as you approach low temperatures, the resistance tends to flatten out, and we see this anomalous metallic state that was really not understood at all at the time. Other people then saw this in semiconductors and other superconductors, and it was really not known what caused this metallic state and what's the interplay between this state and other states. So, back in the day, I worked with my thesis advisor, and we proposed that this metallic state was caused by a new dissipation parameter that came into the phase diagram. So basically, instead of between a superconductor and insulator, you have a metal that's caused by dissipation. And this was, maybe I want to say good enough at the time, because we said even saying that there's dissipation in a superconducting system was something that was kind of novel. But now when I look back on it, it's funny because this is a total tautology, right? We said there's metal because it's dissipative, and the dissipative because it's metal. But of course, those are the same things, right? And so even though we said that there's some dissipative state, it didn't really give insight into what it was physically. And this is something that I've been thinking about for many years since then. And there are theorists who are thinking about this too. And after I think that there was some convergence on the idea that this sort of dissipative state was actually due to phase separation and junction-like behavior within a superconducting system. And so I'll talk particularly about this paper by Spivak, Aredo, and Kivelson, who proposed that you can get this sort of superconducting metal transition, especially at resistances much smaller than the quantum of resistance, if you have superconducting grains inside a normal metal. So then these grains have some critical density for being superconducting or non-superconducting, and it's really the size of the largest grain there that should set the scale of whether the whole system becomes superconducting. Okay. So this was mostly a theory. It's pretty hard to test. But they talked about phase separation in these systems. And I remember when we first started talking about this, I talked to other scientists who were measuring thin film superconductors and seeing metallic states, and they'd always say, oh, but my film is perfect. It's completely homogeneous. It has no disorder at all, right? But what we're talking about is it didn't start out inhomogeneous, but if you have a thin enough system, usually disorder has a huge influence. So if you take a thin system and put it on a substrate, disorder leads to emergent inhomogeneity. And so disorder can break a film up into regions that are both locally superconducting and non-superconducting, and there's a ton of evidence of this, it turns out. So a lot of people who make these thin film superconductors will then go more closely and study using scanning tunneling microscopy or other methods and discover, oh, my system actually has puddles in it. And I always find it funny because it seems like when there's a new material, especially a thin material, there's a first paper discovering it, and then there's like a Nature Physics about 6 months later saying, it's inhomogeneous, it has puddles, right? And I always look at it and say, yeah, I bet it does. So, this happened with these complex oxide superconductors where they discovered that, there were actually puddles in the system, it was inhomogeneous. Or with topological insulators, that if it's thin enough, there are puddles. With a lot of thin films, they've seen a lot of evidence of this. And in general, there's just a lot of evidence of disorder-induced phase separation, even in non-superconducting systems. So graphene close to the Dirac point breaks up into electron hole puddles. Again, non-superconducting topological insulator surface states can break up into puddles of topological and non-topological regions. So in general, I think this question of what sets the scale for ordering in a phase-separated system is really a general problem, really relevant to superconductors, but also relevant just to disordered systems in general. Okay, so the questions are what sort of transitions are expected, how do correlated states emerge, and what determines the onset of superconductivity in these systems? I don't know how to top my head. I'll just keep going. Okay, so we set out to answer these questions, interested in everything I've talked about so far, and wanted to use a model system to study the onset of superconductivity in inhomogeneous systems. So what we ended up using are granular islands of superconducting grains in a non-superconducting matrix, and then studied the size dependence of TC in those islands to determine what set the scale of TC. And so we basically took islands like this, just put leads on them, and then the islands looked like this microscopically, where you have crystalline niobium grains inside, it was an amorphous niobium matrix that wasn't superconducting at the same scale. Okay, so these are systems that if you look at them, if they're relatively large, several microns, well, here's my cookies. They look like an oatmeal cookie. And then as you zoom in a little bit, this is like a 50 nanometer scale, you start to see the chips come in there, right? Starting to look delicious. And then if you're like me and you pick around everything just to get to the chip, you can see even more closely that these are crystalline superconducting niobium pieces in a different sort of matrix. And so this was our model system of superconductors inside a non-superconductor where you could start to see if we see any of these rare grain effects. Okay, so we set out to study these islands. These are electron beam evaporated niobium on a silicon oxide. We changed diameter from 600 to 2500 nanometers. The leads were not superconducting, so just the island should be superconducting. We could see that the grains extend over the height of the film, and we did a lot of studies of the material here to show that it really is amorphous niobium with a higher resistance with grains of lower resistance superconducting niobium embedded in it. Conductive tip AFM was also consistent with this, showing that we had regions of high conductivity and low conductivity across our material. Okay, so we first want to just characterize, we really care about what's happening as we change the diameter of these islands, but we also need to characterize the distribution of grains, since that's going to affect our rare grain physics. So to do that, we use TEM processing to extract the grain sizes and distributions. And we found that about 5 to 7% of the island is covered by these crystalline grains, and that the grains were exponentially distributed. Okay, and the grain size and coverage seemed independent of island diameter. And so this is actually a physical count from TEM of our grain distribution. I want to note that we have many, many grains that are really tiny, less than a nanometer, and very few grains that are larger than 10 nanometers. Okay, and this is relevant because remember the coherence length in our system is about 30 to 40 nanometers. And also, but I should say that there's still a good number of grains larger than that 4 nanometer scale where the energy level spacing matters. We're somewhere in between. Okay, so now we measure these islands as a function of diameter, lock-in measurements. Ooh, and here's the data. Okay, so what do we see? This is resistance versus temperature for different diameters. This is the biggest diameter, and you can see a TC here of almost 9 Kelvin, which is good for niobium. But then you get to these small diameters, and you can see the TC drops all the way down to 4 Kelvin. Okay? And so the TC, the transition of just the islands, varies substantially as we change the diameter. And you can plot this and see it clearly that we have TCs close to 9 Kelvin, what you'd expect for niobium, down to about a micron, and then it drops precipitously almost to 0 as we get below a micron down to the scale that we measured of about 200 nanometers. Now, I work in mesoscopic physics, and I can say that this is really surprising because a micron for mesoscopic physics is huge. Okay? Usually we think about things on the 4 nanometer scale, or where the grains matter, or the 40 nanometer scale where the coherence length matters. But 1,000 nanometers is just big. There's almost nothing that should change at the 1,000 nanometer scale if you're measuring an island. So this was very, very surprising to us when we first saw it. And so we did what any good experimentalist would do. We just measured it a ton of times, right? Just to make sure that this behavior really persisted. And so these are just, I think, like 8 different, it feels like more than 8, because 8 different niobium evaporation runs. And you can see that we get basically the same behavior. It varies a little bit depending on how clean our evaporator is that day. Sometimes the curves shift a little bit up or down or back and forth. But overall, you can see that we get this very strong suppression of TC from 9 Kelvin all the way down to 2 Kelvin. And then, there is data below here, but it's 0, right? From 9 Kelvin to below, to 0, just as we go below around the micron scale. Okay, so we know that this is valid, but why is it happening? Well, one reason that you can get suppression of TC is if you have the presence of a normal metal. It's called an inverse proximity effect. So we wanted to make sure that wasn't the case. I mean, theoretically, it didn't seem like that, but who trusts theories? I'm just kidding. I work with lots of theorists. So we just put gold in many different configurations to see if it changed our transitions. We put no gold, gold underneath a little bit, gold underneath a lot, and we could show that there was no systematic variation in TC as we varied the amount of gold. And in fact, here's a set of islands that the black and the red are just on silicon oxide and insulator, and then the green has the islands on top of gold fully, and you can see we get almost the same behavior. Actually, here, really the same behavior. So it's not the presence of gold that's doing it. as I mentioned, it's not due to this size dependence of the charging energy. We're much, much bigger than that couple nanometer scale that matters there. You may not know, I didn't mention it, but the coherence length actually gets bigger as you get closer to TC, so you might worry about this length scale of the coherence length. It turns out that's still relatively small compared to our island size, even as we get to our transition. And then we also measured islands that were not granular. So we measured tin islands, which had no grains and low disorder. And here you can see tin islands for different diameters all have the same transition, compared to niobium, where they have different transitions. And so somehow this granularity was a key to answering this question of what's happening and what determines the scale of TC. Okay, so how do we understand this TC suppression within each individual island? Well, we first start by just considering an island as a disordered granular system, because that's what it is. And then we realize that this rare grain effect is really what's setting the scale here. So the rare grain idea is that the superconductivity is established via distribution of grain sizes, where the largest grain sets the TC. And this maybe seems obvious because I mentioned it already, but actually this hadn't really been established for these sort of systems, because you don't see it unless you actually have systems small enough where statistically a rare grain matters. Okay? So basically, if you have bigger islands, then you have more grains, the larger chance of having an optimal grain, and therefore a larger TC. So if you have something that's bigger than microns, it'll always superconduct. You'll never notice it. But as you get down to the scales of, half a micron or lower, your probability of having a rare grain gets small enough that TC starts getting very suppressed. Okay, so what's another way we can think about this? Well, we can say, okay, let's compare the probability of having a large grain to our TCs for different island diameters. So here we just did a simulation. We took our distribution of grains, which is here. This is our experimentally extracted distribution of grains. And then we used this just to simulate thousands of islands. I mean, we measured a lot of them, but we couldn't, even my students couldn't measure thousands of them and still graduate in a reasonable time. And so, I see some of them there. They know what I mean. Okay, so we simulated thousands of islands just using this distribution, right? So you take the distribution and simulate big islands and small islands, and then you say, okay, using that distribution, what's the probability? What is the largest grain that we simulate in these islands, given this probability distribution? And we extract that value of the largest grain for thousands of islands. And that's this value here. So we take the radius of the largest grain from the simulation as a function of island diameter. Okay, and you can see that's plotted here. And this kind of makes sense. You can see that the radius of the largest grain is big for the big diameters, and it gets really small for small diameter islands because probability is smaller. And then we just compare this. We say, okay, well then of these largest grains, how many are above the coherence length of niobium? And here we use 38 nanometers, which is approximately right for our islands, but it's also, if you just go to Wikipedia and say coherence of niobium, you get 38 nanometers. So, this is a good approximation of what you'd expect. And you can see that there's kind of a cutoff here where, all of these big islands have grains that are larger than the coherence length, but all of the small islands don't. And if you plot that probability that the largest grain is bigger than the coherence length, you get a curve that looks like this. Okay, so this is probability the largest grain is bigger than the coherence length that we simulated from our distribution. And you should note that it looks nearly identical to our experimental data of TC versus diameter. Okay, and then there's no free parameters here. It's really a remarkable similarity. Okay? And so this to us showed that we really were on the right track, and there's no other way that we know to explain this sort of drop-off in transition temperatures. So we came up, we had actual fits to theory. We could see a pretty good fit to theory. This shows you what your TC is expected to look like as a function of the ratio of your coherence length to the size of the grain, which is what matters there. And it fits pretty well. There's a little bit of scaling there that was probably due to some unseen variations in our average grain diameter with island size, but overall we could see a pretty good fit with theory. Now, the other thing you may ask is that, the shape and the fit of TC is good, but I'm making a statistical argument here. And if you're talking about statistics, then fluctuation should also matter, right? You shouldn't get the same value every time if you're just looking at probability of some large grain. Okay, so here you can say, okay, if we have, if we have some diameters, right, we can simulate in this black curve what the variation in TC should look like, and it should get bigger as you get to smaller and smaller diameters. And eventually it falls off because TC drops to 0, right? So you should say some exponential increase in variation. Okay, so then we just go, we thought of this and said, okay, why don't we just measure a lot of islands of the same diameter and see how the TCs vary? Okay, and what we expect is, again, for large islands, fewer variations, and for small islands, more variations. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw. Right? So we just took one chip and put 10 different islands on it, all the same diameter, all made in the same way, all measured at the same time. And we saw that for a 600 nanometer set of islands, we got variations in TC all over the place. I mean, these are all made identically the same, and it's completely varied. Whereas you double the diameter to 1400 nanometers, and there's almost no variation at all. Right? And again, really clear evidence that it's statistics that's driving the transition here. And we can show that there's an exponential increase in the variance of TC with diameter. 2 minutes? I can do that. Okay, so this again fit pretty well with our model and really showed that we have this rare grain superconductivity. And for people who think about superconductivity, I just want to differentiate this regime. I mean, this is for low resistance samples, which are not close to the quantum of resistance. It's where our gap is bigger than the level spacing, and it's where the coherence length is what sets the relevant scale that damps fluctuations in the superconductor. And it also fits really well with the Spivak-Oredo-Kevelson picture, where they talked about this rare grain superconductivity. And then you get, once the biggest grain goes superconducting, you get this sudden rapid collapse of everything else. The biggest grain goes superconducting, and then the ones that are near it go superconducting. It has a proximity coupled across the metal. So then the next one goes, and the next one goes, and you get a rapid waterfall of superconductivity as soon as that first large grain goes superconducting. Okay, and so this inhomogeneous mesoscopic system is really different from what you see in either individual grains or in macroscopic films. Okay. And as I mentioned before, I think that understanding and actually proving this rare grain superconductivity is really relevant to how superconductivity is established in granular systems, especially where the grain size is smaller than the coherence length. So it's relevant to all of these puddle systems and these disordered systems that I talked about earlier. And in fact, there was a paper a couple years ago which talked about what's called a quantum Griffith singularity, and it's looking at scaling of lots of curves, and it looked really complicated. But if you look at their abstract, they use this complicated scaling arguments to say that that this superconductor metal quantum phase transition with infinite randomness at the critical point, the properties of the system are controlled by rare, large superconducting regions. And so they used all of this scaling dynamics to infer that the basic physics was a rare grain system, right? And whereas in our system, we really were able to show the first direct evidence of this rare grain onset of superconductivity. Okay, there's lots more interesting physics. I'm not going to talk about any of it. You can couple these grains, you can control TC, you can see metallic states, you can see regional correlations, you can put them on graphene, topological insulators, change disorder. There's a ton of fun physics here, but my time is short. So I will conclude that we show that we have suppression of TC in granular islands at large diameters, that this rare region superconductivity is what determines TC in these mesoscopic granular islands. And these are really relevant to understanding many different types of correlated phase-separated systems, from topological surfaces to high TC superconductors and more. I will end by thanking the people who did this work, especially my students, Rita, Serena, Malcolm, Narendra, visiting scientists, Sarang, Jim Zuo. This work was supported by the DOE and the NSF. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
That was great. Anyone except William can ask. Oh.
Always getting singled out. So Nadia, thanks for a really cool talk. So I was wondering, in systems where there's electronic phase transitions or electronics phase separation, do you see a similar thing happening where the rare grains are just sort of there without carefully engineering these?
Yeah. So, yes. So, I mean, what sort of system are you thinking of? Give me an example of.
Well, I go back to the old days of manganite. So not this particular physics of superconductivity, but like where there was always the chemical homogeneity versus electronic, but electronics seemed to sort of be the answer.
Yeah.
And so are there quick, or if I had say a metal insulator transition. Yeah. right, then I would end up with some regions that are big, some that are small, metals, and can you get something like this, same sort of physics occurring, but without engineering the grains, but rather they just emerge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is what I was trying to show in some of these examples. I mean, this is a complex oxide heterostructure, which is an lanthanum oxide heterostructure, which is supposedly homogeneous, but because it's so thin, I think charge disorder and strain and other things lead to inhomogeneities, which then break the system up at near phase transitions or near sort of low density states. It intrinsically breaks the system up, even though it's not an explicitly phase separated system. So I absolutely think it applies to other sorts of 2D systems, especially low density systems that undergo phase transitions. Yeah. I should say that, it is true that what really matters is the scale of the coherence length. And so if you have grains that are, less than a nanometer, if you really, really nanoscale disorder, then you might be dominated by different physics. That's when you get things like Coulomb charging effects, right? So you get Coulomb insulators in that case. But if you have disorder like you're talking about with this emergent electronic inhomogeneities, then I think it matters more that you have this sort of disorder in puddles that dominate.
Okay, thanks.
Jenny.
Fun talk. Thank you so much. I'm curious about imaging. Maybe you had it and it went by so fast that I missed it, but have you done any like MFM imaging and finding those grains within the islands that you're growing?
We have not done. I'm trying to think. So we haven't done MFM imaging of the. So the grains. These grains are easy to see. I mean, these are. Do I have pictures of it? Right. I mean, we can see them physically, right? So we know.
Chocolate chip cookie, or is that your niobium?
No, that's actually my niobium.
Oh. I thought that was a chocolate chip cookie.
I know, we're all hungry. I stressed it too much. I'm sorry. No, this is our actual. So we did TEM on these. I mean, we actually deposited it on TEM grids and then did studies of them as a function of diameter. So this is the actual device. And so we can see these grains really, really clearly, and that's how we get the distribution out of them. We have done MFM imaging on, not on these small things, but in other systems, in larger films we've done it. But then we're dominated by different sorts of physics, especially as we have lots of islands and things. So I don't know. It would be interesting. I mean, it's a little bit hard because as you get a larger film, like I said, then you're dominated, then you're averaging it out because you have enough large grains as the film gets bigger that you don't necessarily see the same physics here. Does that?
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious, like as you're in that transition, between the metallic state and the fully R equals 0 state, are you seeing the superconductivity develop around the big grains first, and that could be, maybe you could image that magnetically?
Yeah, we haven't done that. It might be interesting to do. I agree. Yeah, I completely agree.
Thanks, Nadia.
Yeah. Thank you for the great talk. I'm not sure if I followed the details of the sample creation right, but I'm wondering if you had a very small diameter island and you just dropped a large grain into it, would you just recover the higher transition temperature again?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you exactly would do that. Yeah. So because as soon as that large grain goes superconducting, the other grains are within a coherence length away from that first grain. And so anything within a coherence length then will get automatically proximity coupled to the first one. And so you get a rapid proximity coupling across the whole device. So that's exactly right. Even if I had, grains that are much, smaller in the coherence length somewhat, if I dropped one big one in, the whole thing would then go superconducting pretty rapidly. Yeah, because it's not, what's damping superconductivity is not the size of the grains, it's actually the phase fluctuations on each of the grains are large, right? And so those phase fluctuations are set by the coherence length, not by the gap, not by the gap. Well, I guess the gap size, not by the energy level spacing of not by the particle in a box spacing, but rather by the coherence length of the superconductor. And so that's why it also matters that it's in a metallic matrix, because that's when these sort of fluctuations at the coherence length scale matter, as opposed to an insulating system, or, like I said, for much, much smaller grains.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. I was just curious, you kind of talked about it in passing about putting this on like low dimensional materials like graphene and stuff like that. And so I know there's like this whole field that's been emerging called like twistronics, just by matching lattices. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, or if your group has done any work on that. I was just curious.
Yeah. We work on it in other ways. So one of the questions you might ask is so you can put these grains on things like graphene, and you can, I've shown we put disorder, and we want to see how TC changes when we have it disordered. Now you can imagine putting it in a honeycomb lattice and trying to do some other sort of super lattice out of the grains that match with the graphene underneath. I think that would be a fantastic thing to try. The problem is that to get a super lattice, you really need things that are a much smaller scale. You want it to be closer to the Fermi wavelength. And so superlattice effects generally happen on the 10 to 100 nanometer scale in graphene. And so we wouldn't, we'd have to have control over grains on the nanometer scale and place them in order to really have superlattice effects like this. And that's just a little beyond, quite a bit beyond our lithographic capabilities. So I think it's a great idea, but the scale at which these things happen have to be comparable to the original lattice, which is quite small, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Go. So,
say go.
Yeah,
I'm gone.
No, not you. So we wanted to transition to a kind of a panel discussion, and all the topics that we've discussed today are within bounds. So feel free to ask questions, or I'll start slinging hard ones. Questions? Arlene, you have one. No? All right. I misread your eye contact.
Hi, I'm an undergrad junior physics major at Howard University, and I just have a question about any tips you might have for navigating grad school as a Black woman, especially like if you might not have like the most support, or you might be like the only one in your program.
I'll start. No.
Jamie, do you want to start, or would you like me to?
Sure, I can start. I would say make sure that you have a community around you, multiple communities even, circles of friends, colleagues, supporters, family, former teachers, who will be able to help to give you a nudge or a pep talk when you need one. Howard University is a very fine university. It's almost as fine as Florida A&M University, but you are getting a solid education there. They use the same textbooks at small teaching colleges or big Howards as they do at big R1 universities. So have confidence that what you are learning is enough for you to succeed in graduate school. In fact, there's been quite a few young women who have completed their PhDs after coming from Howard University. So I also recommend that you join our Facebook group for AAWIP, and you can feel free to reach out to me. I can put you in touch with some students or alumni, and talk to your professors. They're going to have a lot of good advice for you.
Thanks, Jamie. I also want to say that tomorrow there are actually two different full sessions on surviving graduate school. There's one in the morning and there's one at 3. And I'm actually talking in the afternoon one. But I will say what I'm going to say there, which is that graduate school is hard. It's not I wouldn't. Well, it's hard. It gets easier. I tell people that I found it really hard up until the 3rd year, and then there's a phase transition there where it just got easier. It's like you think nothing's ever going to work, and all of a sudden things start working. You know what you're doing, and then you have to leave. So it does get easier, but also I don't. A couple things. It's surviving graduate school. It is your life, and so I would love us to be able to think of it as less surviving and more of thriving. What do we do to thrive as our whole selves within graduate school in our 20s, right? Your 20s. How do you thrive and live your life and also do really good work? And for me, a lot of that involved having peers that I really trusted and that I could talk to. And being one of the only, I couldn't find, there weren't a lot of other Black women in physics when I was there, but there were people in engineering, and there were people in the dance department and in English. I had friends across campus and even on other campuses who, some of them I saw once a year, some of them I saw once a month. I went every year as the National Conference of Black Physicists. These were things that were very important to me personally and sustained me. And even being at these places for one day at a time, one day a year or a couple days or something could sustain me through months and months of graduate school. So, finding cohorts, finding peers, and finding places to go where you feel supported can really help as well.
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Staying in great physical condition will also help you because that will relieve stress. At least that's what I did when I was in graduate school. I made sure I stayed in the gym. Also, just meditating, trying to keep yourself centered besides everything that everyone else just mentioned. I would definitely add physical activity.
Well, that's great. Where were y'all when I was in school? Great answers.
Well, I should say, I know this is all easier said than done, but we just do our best and be kind to ourselves, which is really something to keep in mind.
Any other questions or comments? Step right up.
Hi, great talk, Nadia, by the way. So was there ever a time in graduate school that you wanted to quit? And what made you not quit? Just full disclosure, I wanted to quit like every other week. So I'm just curious how you overcame that.
Only work those on weeks.
Yeah.
That's how you do it.
Hi, Erica. Yeah. When it said it was hard up until third year. I guess I first started, I thought I was just going to get kicked out because I thought I failed my qual. And so I thought they'd just make that decision for me. And then it turns out I didn't fail and they wouldn't have kicked me out anyway, but whatever. So it was, part of it is, I think I both wanted to quit and I was just looking, I half expected to just be kicked out because I wasn't going to succeed. Like I remember after my third year, I thought that I was going to be the first graduate student to ever have to leave, not because I didn't have good data, but because I never even got a device. I had a blank lab notebook and they're going to be like, well, there's nothing, right? And it was a terrifying feeling. And so, I think that, and maybe part of that, my feeling of them, they were definitely going to kick me out or I was going to have to leave was part of me not knowing whether I wanted to be there at all at some point and, when it was really hard. But I think for me personally, I was doing it because I was really interested in it. And so for me personally, having a sense of, and this is, I think what's helped me a lot of my time through physics is having a sense of my own priorities and interests are what motivate me despite a lot of the other noise and despite a lot of the things going on around me. And I always feel like as long as I'm interested in it, then I should just keep going and pursuing what I want to do until someone does kick me out, right? If they make me leave, then so be it. But until that point, I'm not going to make myself leave because it's what I want to do. So that focus has really been impactful for me.
I would say, yes, there were definitely many times where I wanted to leave. What sustained me through those times was the knowledge that life would be so much better if I completed this big thing that I was trying to do. I have friends even now who decided to leave the program or were asked to leave. And even in our 40s, some of them are like, I'm thinking about going back to grad school. I still want to finish my degree. So if it's something that you really want to do, I say do it while you're still young and spry and not used to having nice cars and nice things. So I would say power through and do it now. And again, I give the same advice as I gave to the first young lady, which is surround yourself with people who can support and sustain you through the difficult times. So if you have a girl squad of other grad students all over the country, talk to them once a week, once a quarter, once a month, and they will also share probably that they're having some of the same challenges, whether it's an academic challenge or a family challenge or something like that. Talking to other people normalizes the hard times. And also talking to those who come before you, you may find that, oh, somebody else went through this exact same thing and they survived it and they're doing great. I mentioned that I left Brown. I actually did fail my qualifying exams twice. And so I was invited to leave and I had to make a choice. Am I gonna, reapply other places or am I gonna take a job? It was the support of my professors back at FAMU, actually, who encouraged me to reapply. And they were like, oh, this professor right here, he had to leave and he had to make a transition and he went to another school and you'll be fine. So having that support and knowing that when challenges come, it's not unique to you. It's not the first time, and other people have been able to get through it and push through and survive.
Jersey, anything to add?
Well, I was at the Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory as an undergraduate. I had completed my undergrad, and I went there to work in the physical oceanography department. And I had considered getting a master's degree, but I found out that I couldn't get a master's directly from Columbia. I would pick that up on the way to the PhD. Well, I met a young woman who was also working at the laboratory, and she had failed the quals, and she sort of discouraged me because I was thinking, oh my goodness, all I want is a master's right now. I wasn't thinking PhD. So what I did, I went to NYU. So I didn't have to quit. I just decided that that's not what I wanted to do, was get a PhD. And then once I got to NYU, I got the master's, and then they offered me the opportunity to get my PhD. So I said, okay, I'll keep moving forward because I didn't have anything else going on in my life. So, you just have to make a decision that's best for you.
You want an anecdote from a guy or just women? I was going to say, so my threshold came much earlier. It was my first year. Because I was completely set up. I said, I'm only taking 4 classes. I've had them all before. This is going to be trivial. And I could not make the transition from classes to actually doing the homework. I just couldn't do it. It didn't make any sense to me how you can go from K minus K prime and actually, why was that tensor calculus? Didn't make any sense. And I had a friend of mine from undergrad who was living with me because he was doing a internship at Ford. And I was telling him how much I was struggling, and he looked at me and he just started laughing. He just laughed, and I was homicidal. I was like, I'm gonna kill you, stop laughing. And he said, I've never seen you struggle in anything. What are you talking about? It was just, so going back to what Jamie said and what Jersey said and what Nadia said, and having that network of people that know you even when you're questioning yourself is what will get you through it. Because he just couldn't even consider, everything I said sounded absurd that I couldn't do something like that. And I was like, oh, I guess you are right. And yeah, so but had he not been there, I may not have, had he not laughed at me, I may not have finished school. So anyway, it happens to everyone is the punchline.
So I guess I have a follow-up question for Jamie. So I think from, at least there's over 100 of us now, we all have different experiences that may be helpful for others coming afterwards. I really believe that you have to educate both by experiences, but providing people with tools. So do you have access to a platform for the socially averse people that do not have access to Facebook? Is there sort of like a platform where you could deliver these sort of tips without necessarily passing on the trauma, right? So in some ways, being able to say, look, these are some of the things that I wish I had known without telling you the experiences, because we don't necessarily want to scare people off.
Jamie, you're muted.
The mute button. So it's a really good idea. One of the things that we do is that we do send out like highlights of celebrations, we call them, of different accomplishments of various Black women in physics. But we do that mostly through the social media. I would say I've met people who are like, I just don't want any social media, and I recommend to them make one account on a throwaway email. Don't make any friends. Join our group, because that is where it is all happening, and that is where the interaction is. I understand and respect the desire not to interact with social media, but it can be mitigated. But also, I think that we could easily add like a reading list or a book list on the webpage, because there's a number of books that I think would be really useful for people. But we're open to suggestions. That's a good suggestion. I'm definitely going to take it to the board.
Hi, I have a quick question. So I'm a relatively new department chair at Syracuse University, and we have had a history of graduating PhDs, both men and women who are Black. And but in recent history, there was management issues, I would say, and as we know, leadership matters. And so we didn't have a greatest of reputations, and in particular, we have a few recent graduates who, rightly so, had bad experiences. And how do I get out the word that we are under new management? And all right, I did it. Okay. No, but seriously, I would love to. I mean, I've been making a lot of attempts and strides, but for me, it is really important that we start with the faculty. We actually, like I said, we've had a fairly good tradition. We have we're not. Okay, we're double the national average, which doesn't help. Like the national average is super small, but I personally, this is part of my personal mission. We're trying to. I personally want to really increase the diversity of the faculty. I think that's going to make a huge difference. And I'm doing the legwork. I'm doing the recruiting. It's going to take a while. It might be past my time. As we know, chairs turn over. And so, I'm also doing the community building, trying to do all that work, but I do want people, I kind of want to get out the word that, we're a place that we want to affect change in this positive way at Syracuse University. And, are there ways that we can do this through, National Society of Black Physicists? Are there ways that we can do this through, the African-American women in physics? Like, how do I get my word out? I don't want to intrude on your spaces, but simultaneously, I want to let people know that that we are trying. We're really working on this now, and I think that we're trying to build something.
Yeah, I can say something quick because I have my hands in different pots here. Thanks for your comment, Jennifer. The APS has a bridge program and a bridge partnership program. And I don't know if you guys are part of that, but the bridge partnership program is something where if a university, if Monica can correct me if I get any of this wrong, but basically they have recommendations. So they will give a university access to a list of people who want to matriculate in graduate school as part of a bridge program. Often many of people are underrepresented. But the university has to put in a proposal showing how they will support the students that they have. And this includes having a proposal that includes mentoring and, having a decent climate and making sure that that quals and grades and things are fair. And then there's a site visit associated with that from members of the Committee on Minorities of the APS. And that's, to me, I think that's one of the best ways of, one, ensuring that your department really has made changes. Because, often there's one department, I'm not saying it's in your case, but sometimes there's one department head who really wants change, but when the site visit committee comes, they find, okay, there's other structural problems here that you need to address, and that can be very helpful for a department. But then after that, if you go through this and call yourself a partnership institution, those are listed everywhere. And I think that now students know to look for that. And so if you really are an APS Bridge partnership institution, they know that you understand, GRE scores and qual and supporting students. And I think that that's one really well-established way of getting your foot in that door. Did I say everything right, Monica? Okay. But
I agree with everything that Nadia said. I would add that recruiting at the National Society of Black Physicists Conference is key if you are interested in recruiting African American students. I often say to students, if you're looking for a school that you know wants Black students, those schools are recruiting at NSBP. And if they're not there, they may still want you, but you don't know. So SACNAS, NSBP, all of these other underrepresented minority-focused conferences for people in STEM, those are the places. You could also offer to give a talk at an HBCU. A lot of them don't have the budget to bring in speakers from top universities. You could ask them, hey, I'd love to give a talk. Can I give a Zoom talk? Can I, talk about the research and what we're doing at our university? Some of these HBCUs have like 20, 30, 40 undergrads. Half of them are going to apply to graduate school. And just also what Nadia said about the bridge program. So.
I just want to add one little thing that I forgot since Arlene's here, and I didn't want to miss this, that you can join a team up group. So Team Up is dedicated to climate change within a department and has mini workshops throughout the year and things that people can do within a department to make sure that the climate is improving, that they're supporting students, that people are really working to affect change. And it's a really well-developed program. So I don't know if you guys have a Team Up group right now, but no. But okay, but we can. Yeah, and maybe Arlene can say more, but I just, I'll let you say more. But the thing is that once you start joining groups like this, the word does get out. I mean, many of us are part of these, right? And if I know that, you're there and then students come through, then I think it's much easier to recommend that students go to Syracuse. I don't know if Arlene wanted to.
Looks like she does. No, I just wanted to add, yes, we do have Team Up teams, but we're also launching a new program called Team Up Together that we're working through, and that's going to be where we're going to be supporting departments to, develop programs that will help to increase African Americans' earning degrees, but also change the climate, but from a systemic point of view.
I just want to add to that. Actually, so the students report to me when they have microaggressions. I have an anonymous form, and they just know to come to me now, and it's all student on student. It's very rarely faculty on student. It's never staff on student. It's all between the students. And so I'm working really hard on that culture. And sorry to use this term, but it's my most woke white students who are doing this. And they have an internal monologue about themselves that they're perfect in this space, whereas my faculty don't have that internal monologue. So they've been able to affect change in themselves. And so I'd love any help on that, actually, because it's having that conversation with that population of students.
So I encourage you to look at Team Up, the report, and you can find it at aip.org/teamup, and take a look at that, and then we can talk.
I just have a follow-up question with regards to, I guess, institutions attempting to improve their images as a result of the harm that was caused by the department itself and may continue to be caused by the department. I would just say, in this sort of journey to improve your own personal reputation, are there ways we can also not only acknowledge the hurt and the pain that was caused and prevent this sort of attempt to almost sticker over these events without erasing the students that have been harmed, or at least getting feedback from the students that were harmed or may continue to be harmed in these spaces despite having IDEA, despite having bridge programs, et cetera. Harvard has had them. Other institutions I've been a part of have also had these kinds of programs. This is not new. So I would caution against, yes, I think it's great that you take advantage of these resources, but I would also place out the question about how do we take advantage of these resources without further causing harm and erasing those students, and also adequately getting feedback from those specific students. I'll give you an example. In one of our departments at Harvard during the George Floyd awakening that everyone suddenly had, they decided to bring students to talk about their experiences as Black students. None of those students went to Harvard. They all were students from other universities speaking about their experiences as Black students at Harvard in that particular department, which is insulting because it prevented the department from being able to see themselves in the mirror. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is, in your journey to improve your image, that you don't necessarily forget who you are when you are looking in the mirror as a department. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
The one thing I'd add, Jennifer, is don't think about it as coming into our spaces. These are our spaces, right? NSBP, I'll speak on behalf of NSBP, would welcome this discussion. You know, it's not a, yeah, it's, don't think of it as, you're invited to the cookout. Questions, comments? Oh, no, no concerns. All right. Yeah. Well.
Can I ask a quick question, but I don't think that it will. So Bill Phillips is watching online, and he wasn't sure how to ask a question, so he texted me to see if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about the strange response to the Science article. You know.
Well, you text Bill and you asked him, what does he mean by the strange response?
So Thomas knew what he meant. There was an article, and you mentioned something about it right at the beginning, that you would be happy to talk to people offline about this article.
He's asked something about me?
Yeah.
Oh, Phillips? I'm on his radar? Yeah, okay.
Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I know it was a minority-based article.
Right. Well, what was my strange comment?
Well, what are your feelings? Not strange.
Oh, my feelings.
Could you help him to think more openly? He has not read it yet, and so wanted some perspective.
Oh. Yes. Yeah, maybe I should. I'll divert you.
Come on. No, I'm not doing it.
No, we get it.
You might be talking about the Science article that you referenced, April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, no, I know the article. I'm just trying to think about how I'm going to respond.
I think they're worth reading.
That girl good. That girl good. So Angie, well, there's a quote that I misattributed to Simone de Beauvoir, and I found out that it was actually said by Marie Scheer. And the quote is that feminism is the radical belief that women are people, right? And those articles, when I read them, they tended to isolate. Like one of them was about people who chose to go to high schools and community colleges, you know, as though over other academic institutions, as though that was an actual conscious, you know, unbiased choice that they made. Like, no, I don't want to go teach at Yale. I'm going to teach at Corning Community College. And it just seemed like people who are underrepresented are being treated as though they're not subjected to the same forces that everyone else is subjected to, that there's some different identity, and this identity overdetermines who I am as a Black male physicist. I mean, I can't solve differential equations any differently as a Black male physicist than anyone else. So so some of those articles, this is only my perspective, and I think maybe this is what you were getting at, Dr. Phillips, is that it didn't seem like they were particularly rigorous, nor did they really capture the agency of the people that they were discussing. And some of it was just shoddy. I mean, someone was quoted as being the first and only Black physicist at a university, and it turns out they were not the first, nor were they even in the physics department. So I guess there was a retraction printed on that, but there were no solutions other than some of the quotes, including my colleague's quote, and one of them that she heard about through someone else. She didn't read it, but it was a good quote. But when we kind of assume this underrepresented communities, we assume that they are a spherical cow. And that's what I saw in a lot of those articles. You can, if he texts you back, let me know. But again, I'm not representing anyone but myself. Definitely not my company. If I can still go back there. Jacita or Jamie, anything you want to add?
I have to admit, I didn't read all of the articles, and I'm like, oh wow, I probably should have read them all.
No.
But the one that I read was on HBCUs not being able to do it all, and I also didn't enjoy that one because I felt like it was very one-sided, and so
yeah,
I don't know. I'm happy to take other questions.
Yeah. We can. On that note, no, but no, and I'm perfectly willing. I don't know if he probably doesn't remember me, but when I was at Howard, I used to come up and do work in the lab right beside his at NIST. That was the year he got the Nobel Prize, as a matter of fact. So, any other questions or comments before we wrap up? I definitely appreciate your attending this. The diversity of topics was exactly the kinds of interactions that I had so often with Dr. Hobbs Moore. I mean, she loved science, she loved the community, she loved this history, and so I really appreciate your kind of bearing with the fact that we were had a meeting that would capture that complexity. So thank you so much for your time and attention today, and have a good rest of the conference.